to proceed without him, and he'll join us in closed session.
Okay.
So let's get started. Good evening and welcome to the meeting of the Palo Alto Unified School District Board of Trustees. Today is September 8th and the time is 5:33 p.m. We'll be recessing to closed session shortly, and after closed session, we'll return for our open session business at around 6:30 p.m. For tonight's closed session, we'll be discussing two things. One is conference with legal counsel, CalPERS versus MAC and PAUSD. And the second is conference with labor negotiators related to PAEA and CSEA. If you have any comments on those particular issues, you can virtually raise your hand in Zoom by clicking on the icon or by pressing *9 if you're dialed in by phone. And I'll wait a second to see if anybody is commenting on closed session items. And seeing none, we can now adjourn to closed session, and we'll see you all at 6:30. All right, I think we have everybody. Good evening. This is the meeting of the Palo Alto Unified School District Board of Trustees. Today is Tuesday, September 8th, and the time is 6:34 p.m. The board met earlier in closed session and took no reportable action. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping issues relating to virtual meetings. If you wish to comment on an item, when we get to that item, I'll ask that you electronically raise your hand. You can do that either by clicking raised hand icon in Zoom or pressing *9 if you're calling by phone. I would like to ask if people would not raise their hands until we actually get to the item that you're wanting to comment on, because otherwise we have to check in with you every item to make sure that it wasn't the item, including things like agenda approval and so on. So just wait until the item comes. There'll be plenty of time for people to raise their hands. We'll wait and make sure everybody gets a chance to do it. We've started using the practice where we ask people to get their hand raised on an item anytime before the first person on that item is done speaking. So we'll note everyone in the queue when the person finishes speaking, reset the amount of time per person, and then take it from there. And finally, since we're not all together, we'll be doing roll call votes on all items. As the board secretary, Dr. Austin will do the honors on that. So that's our housekeeping, and our next item is approval of the agenda. Is there a motion?
So moved.
I'll second.
Moved by Ms. Bacon-Caswell and seconded by Ms. DeBrienza. Dr. Austin, can you take the roll?
Absolutely. Preferential vote for our students. Ms. Halta?
Aye.
Mr. Lee?
Aye.
DeBrienza?
Aye.
Ms. Bacon-Caswell?
Aye.
Sir Dauber?
Aye.
Sir Durop?
Aye.
Mr. Collins?
I also vote aye. Okay, so now we have an agenda, and the first item on it is Superintendent of Schools report. Please go ahead, Dr. Austin.
All right, thank you. A few things. We are still going through the survey results, but I did want to talk about some takeaways that we feel confident reporting right now, and we're still disaggregating some of the data. We had a lot of open-ended comments, which are good as well. But overall, there's no doubt that there's more satisfaction than dissatisfaction, and an overall nod to the improvement in the fall versus the spring. So while not surprising, it was good to see that reflected in the results. There was a surprising amount of alignment between our students and parents. So both saw the program similarly in most areas. So that was nice to see that those are relatively calibrated. Secondary students and parents brought up some dissatisfaction with the Monday schedules. We're not exactly sure what to do with that yet, except for that it is noted, and it's something that we would like to evaluate and see if there's something that we can do to make that a little bit better for our student experience. Our elementary students, in this case, elementary school parents, stated that the amount of Zoom is a lot for our early elementary students. We completely agree with that. And hopefully that will be resolved pretty soon by doing some more calibration on what we're trying to do in our classrooms and eventually bringing students back to school sites. Total numbers, 1,435 students, 2,328 parents, for a total of 3,763 responses. So really nice sample size. PAUSD return today was a soft return, which really meant kind of a walkthrough of the setups and facilities. All of the school sites, and this is secondary only right now, are keeping room to grow, but we feel good about our preparation. We're going to start small and make sure that we get it right. I'd really like to thank Ms. Conaway and Mr. Vittoria for taking the lead on this work. It has been quite an effort. Each school site is owning their piece, and we feel good about our start for tomorrow. Post-secondary futures will return on Thursday. We wanted to make sure that Coverly looked as good as it should for the students that we value so highly. So we pushed that back just a couple days to make sure it was dialed out, and I'm really glad we did. So thank you to the staff for that recommendation and for the work that occurred even over the weekend. Made a couple visits down there and saw crews working hard. It looks good. I know our staff is down there working hard. So very thankful for our classified staff and for teachers to coming back even a little earlier to help our highest needs students. So we feel good about that. As I'm sure many people have noticed, Santa Clara County moved from the purple to red areas today. The criteria for reopening related to COVID. 14 days from now, if we remain in red, schools in Santa Clara County will be eligible for return. Our October 12th date is still firm for a larger return at the elementary school level. The secondaries are going to require some more thought and discussion. And the staff is still working on a time that makes sense to identify a time for the elementary families to commit to either hybrid or distance learning that gives enough time for decision-making for parents with enough information, but also leaves enough time for our staff here to redistribute staff and students. So it is going to be quite a job to move things around. So we're thinking somewhere in the next couple of weeks for sure, it's going to be time for parents to commit to either the rest of the year in distance learning or to hybrid so that we can staff appropriately. And we will have that date firmed up here shortly. That's it for me tonight. Thank you.
Okay, I noticed that one hand is up, and let's find out if there's a comment on the superintendent's report. Up, two hands are up. First name only, Kathy. Is this a comment on the superintendent's report?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Collins.
Please go ahead. Yeah, give us a second and let us get the timer going, okay?
All right.
There it is. All right, proceed when ready.
Thank you. I wanted to comment on a couple of things relative to the superintendent's report. Per Dr. Austin's last comments about families having to commit to either distance learning or hybrid. According to SB 98, families do not need to make a commitment of a year or for the rest of the school year. Actually, if they choose distance learning, it must be provided. And of course, circumstances can change as things proceed. So those families, according to the law, must be provided distance learning if they feel their student is at risk. And if they change their mind, then obviously they would also be provided access to in-person learning. So I wanted to just note that about his comments. I also wanted to bring up about today's technical snafu, Palo Alto Unified not providing access to students, having a technical difficulty where students were unable to access and log in and reach their classes, their Zoom classes. And wanted to ask Dr. Austin and the staff to think about how they will be providing instruction that is missed in a case such as that to students. Of course, students could also have their own connectivity issues as a separate issue. And so how will Palo Alto Unified provide instruction to those students in situations where Palo Alto Unified has a technical snafu or students do? Of course, recording the instruction would solve both problems, recorded instruction for later viewing. And some teachers are doing that, but Palo Alto Unified has not required itself or its teachers to record classroom period instruction, which is unfortunate. So those are my comments. Thank you. I do want to make sure to request that certificated personnel items be taken off the consent calendar, please. Thank you.
When we get that item, we can address it then. Next is Stephanie Compton and then Michelle Yee, followed by Anne Marie. I'll leave it at that. Stephanie, are you there?
She appears to be muted.
Oh, sorry, I'm unmuted now.
There you go.
We are all still learning a bit about Zoom. So I just have a quick question for Dr. Austin. While I appreciate that it's easier to get the elementary school kids back first, I would be very interested to know when we will at least have a date about when we will know when the secondary students are going back, because I have a middle schooler and a high schooler, and they need their school community pretty badly. So I'm anxious to hear when we will know more about that. Thanks.
Thank you. Michelle Yee, followed by Anne Marie, and then the last speaker is CSEA President Meb Steiner.
Thank you. I'm a teacher, a parent, and my partner is a special ed teacher. And less than 7 months after we were all sent home to be safe from this pandemic, we still don't know very much about this disease. What we do know is that many people are suffering chronic health issues after recovering from COVID-19. One epidemiologist in the UK said this on the 95th day after onset of his symptoms: "I'm unable to get out of bed for more than 3 hours at a stretch. My arms and legs are permanently fizzing as if injected with Szechuan peppercorns. I have ringing in the ears, intermittent brain fog, palpitations, and dramatic mood swings. So why take this risk? The worst case outcome, besides death, of course, is long-term disability. The likelihood of the worst case happening to any one of us is not known right now, and we can do something to prevent it. My special ed colleagues should not return in person until we all return in person. We are in this together. Move cautiously to protect students, educators, and the public community."
I'm in a meeting. Okay, thank you. And then Anne Marie, follow, and please tell us how to pronounce your last name. Meb Steiner. I'm sorry, and then Meb Steiner will be the last speaker. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Anne-Marie Lekerker or Lekkerkerker, whatever, however you want it. So I'm a mom of a Pally boy and a Green boy, but I'm also part of a parent group with diverse industry, medical, and scientific expertises that got together for the first time early August. And we as parents want our kids back in school, meaning a safe return to long-term in-person learning with support from all stakeholders, students, teachers, communities, staff, and districts. And we believe that frequent and mass testing of PAUSD students, teachers, and staff is critical to such safe and prolonged return to school. We volunteer to help with this research, implementation, and fundraising for this testing. And we have already done significant research to date on various COVID-19 testing options and initial cost projections. So as our county now is moving from purple to red and clearly clearing the path towards reopening schools, aiming at as early as October 12th, we want to emphasize that we are eager to volunteer our expertise, our time, and our industry connections to make this happen. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. And then the last speaker is Meb Steiner. And Meb, before you begin, let me just say, there are a couple of people who have raised their hands after the first speaker had finished, and by our new practice, because we need to set the time for all speakers fairly, we have to close the queue after the first speaker begins. So apologies to those people. Go ahead, Meb. Sorry about that.
So thank you very much, Meb Steiner, President of CSEA Palo Alto Chapter 301. I'd like to just start by sharing a little bit of staff perspective and reiterating once again that as we think about what staff needs, that everything that we think about for our students who are our primary concern, that we replace the word student with staff, whether it's making decisions or worrying about their health or safety. I'd like to share with you an answer that managing editor Monita Bell of Teaching Tolerance shared. Teaching Tolerance has done a lot of work on surveying educators around the country and informing their work to provide resources. The question that was posed to her is, what worries you most about this crisis? Her answer, I'm most worried about the fact that educators, students, and their families, like most of us, are dealing with varying levels of stress, anxiety, and trauma right now. And this will continue to be the case for quite some time. Yet people in positions of power in many places around the country are still expecting educators and students to get work done and meet expectations that don't make sense. People are losing loved ones to this disease. People are grieving and managing all manner of stressors. I'm worried that decision makers will be so focused on getting back to normal that they will ignore the very human needs of healing, centering relationships, and building community that will need to happen when school communities are able to safely get back together. I share this because I just urge us as a school community to give staff the same care, consideration, and respect that we give our students and their families, who rightly deserve it, and so do our staff. I urge us to really reach out to our staff, communicate early, share what is happening, rather than announcing decisions last minute and asking staff to adapt to those decisions. I have heard from so many people who are worried and scared and don't want to have to choose between their health and safety and their livelihood. I really, really urge our district to think about this and to spend a lot of time on focusing on staff, physical, mental, and emotional needs, because our working environment and the state of our health directly impacts our students' learning environment. It is one and the same. And I urge us to come together as a community to support everyone so that we can most effectively support our students. Thank you.
Thank you. And for those who came in the queue late, I should have said this before, I apologize. You can always email the board at board@pausd.org. And there is no time limit on emails. So, and I know the board members promptly and fully read their emails, so I urge you to do that. Even if you do speak, it's also useful to get your comments in writing. All right, the next item is student board members reports. And why don't we, I can't remember who started last time, but why don't we start with Mr. Lee this time?
All right. Thank you, Mr. Collins. So first of all, on the survey results, the survey, we're thankful that the district gave this opportunity for students to provide feedback. I know a lot of students have messaged me about their concerns and their feedback about distance learning, and I'm happy that the district is collecting those results from the survey, and I hope that there will be changes and improvements made based on what we find out from the survey. But moving on to some events that have been going on at Gunn, I'll start out with some things that have already passed. So first of all, we had our freshman elections 2 weeks ago. So we're welcoming 3 new members to SEC. Can't wait to get to know them over this year. Next of all, we had back to school night last Wednesday. Teachers each recorded a video for their course, and parents were able to see those videos through their child's Schoology account. We also had a trivia day last Friday. So teams of 4 from each grade competed in a Jeopardy style tournament about pop culture and gun facts. And I'm happy to say that the seniors won. Moreover, we had our mask competition. So students designed face masks, and now the student body is going to vote on their favorite one. I looked at all of the designs and they're all amazing. So if you guys want a mask, I'm sure we'll be able to provide one for you. On to some ongoing events. This week is Suicide Prevention Week, so our Wellness Commissioner is working with the Wellness Center to provide various tips for how to how to improve wellness during this time. Moreover, club chartering is going on. That will wrap up on Friday. And some upcoming events, we have National Hispanic Heritage Month, which will start next week. And our diversity commissioner is working to plan some great events to celebrate the occasion. That's all from me.
Thank you. That was great. Ms. Alta, Ms. Atla, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Like Gun, we also held our freshman elections. We're welcoming our freshman president, Shamshir Singh, as president and Sophia Kim as our VP. In light of some recent events, ASB did a press release in order to encourage positive behavior on any online platform. Outdoor facilities will be reopening at Pali on September 13th. Back to school night was on September 3rd, and teachers recorded videos, and ASB got a feature in an intro video. We had a transfer student luncheon last week, and we are in the middle of chartering our clubs, and we have almost 100 clubs so far. Club Day 2 will be held virtually on Zoom on September 16th. And ASB is starting committees on Thursday to start planning virtual events. That's it for me.
Terrific. Thank you. Our next item is a report from Capital Advisors. But before we do that, I do want to take a second and point out one thing. You can see behind Dr. Austin, there are a considerable flock of Mylar balloons. And that's because today is Dr. Austin's. Dr. Austin, can I say what birthday it is?
Absolutely.
Today is Dr. Austin's 50th birthday. So congratulations, Dr. Austin, on that milestone.
Thank you. It's been awesome.
I hope you get another 50.
Yeah, we'll see. I'd like to introduce our guest tonight, Kevin Gordon from Capital Advisors. And Kevin has been with us before. For those of you new to watching some of our board meetings, Kevin is the founder, CEO of Capital Advisors, recognized as one of the top lobbyists for education issues in the state. In fact, I'd say the top. And I really did not give him much of an agenda for tonight at all, with the exception of speaking to some educational issues and where they stand in legislation and interpretation, and then to make himself available to answer questions that that may arise from the board. So
Dr. Austin, that sounds like a great item. The only thing missing from it is Kevin, who doesn't. Derek, did we look in the attendees and see if maybe he snuck in there?
Yes, I have. I don't see him in the attendees either.
Okay.
Kevin, okay. That is kind of a bummer, Kevin. He has written me even just recently, so I'm not sure if he's having an issue getting in. We can, if you would like to, Mr. Collins, go to the consent.
Yeah, so why don't we do that? We'll go through the consent calendar, and while we're doing that, and I can take the roll call vote on that. And while they're doing that, you can try to work it out with Mr. Gordon.
We'll figure him out right now.
Okay. All right. So, I'm sorry. Go to the consent calendar. I mean, first we have open forum. So why don't we do open forum next, and then we can do Mr. Gordon afterwards. Okay. So apologies to the audience for our confusion on that. So next is open forum. Anybody wishing to address the board on non-agendized items may do so at this time. And we also encourage you to send written comments, whether you speak or not, to us at board@pausd.org. And so now is the time to raise your hand if you want to speak at open forum. And it would be really useful because it will help us determine what the count is, which by our bylaws determines the amount of time each speaker gets to speak. And so I'll wait just another beat or two and see what our count is. So I'm going to say that it's going to be over 20, which means it'll be 1 minute per person. It's over 20 now. So we'll go 1 minute per person, and starting with first name Kathy. Then, I'm sorry, let me call the next two. And then PAEA President Terry Baldwin, followed by Ashley Hung. Go ahead, Kathy.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. It's Kathy Jordan. I noted that Dr. Austin said that he mentioned October 12th for a possible in-person return for elementary school students, but then didn't mention a definite date for secondary school students, possible return to in-person instruction. I'm sort of baffled by that because the law says, SB 98 says that school districts, LEAs, should offer in-person instruction to the greatest extent possible, which means since Santa Clara County is currently on a 14-day window for reopening, that the earliest possible date would be 14 days from now. I understand October 12th was put into the MOU with the teachers union. So I wouldn't understand why there'd be any delay past October 12th at the latest, assuming Santa Clara County stays within the criteria. Thank you.
It's a rule on Zoom calls that someone has to speak while muted. So I did it. I checked it off. The next person is Terry Baldwin, followed by Ashley Hung, followed by Nandini Mohan.
Great, thank you. I want to reiterate what my colleague, Ms. Steiner, said. She said it very well, that we really need to look at teachers and all staff health and safety, because our working conditions are our students' learning conditions. And we hear that the district has a safety plan, but we don't really know the details of that plan. We have a lot of questions. I might not get through them all, so I'll email them, but we have heard there's social distancing markers and signs in place, which is a great start, but we haven't heard the details of the safety protocols. Who's monitoring the bathrooms and using social distancing in them? Who are the bathrooms being cleaned on a regular schedule? What are the administrators' procedures if students don't comply with wearing masks and social distancing? And there's just so many more I'm not going to get through. But one big one, are there nurses? Are we going to hire more nurses and have them at each site? This is a pandemic. We need to be aware of that and keep everyone safe.
Thank you. Ashley Hung and then Nandini Mohan. Oh, something's happening. There we go. So sorry, Ashley Hung, then Nandini Mohan, and then Wendy Chu.
Hi, I'm Ashley Hung, and I'm a sophomore at Pali. First of all, I would just like to thank Superintendent Dawn Austin for taking into consideration the revision of our Monday schedule. I spoke at the last board meeting about this, but I just wanted to come on here again to restate my opinions. I, as well as countless other PAUSD students and even teachers, feel that the Monday distance learning schedule must be revised. With 30-minute blocks and all 7 periods in one day, it is nearly impossible to learn on Mondays. Not only is it difficult to learn content in such a short period of time, it is also tiring having to shift our focus to so many different topics in a day. I think that it is imperative to make a change to the Monday schedule, possibly setting Mondays as an asynchronous learning day. On these days, students can catch up on work and learn through Schoology, as well as other online learning platforms, without having to join so many Zoom meetings and cram so much into the school day. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next is Nandini Mohan, followed by Wendy Chu, followed by Adriana Aro.
Hi, my name is Nandini Mohan, and this is my 11th year as a Futures teacher at Fletcher Middle School. I'm also the Futures teacher who successfully developed and implemented the Synchronous Secondary Online ESY program during the summer by utilizing individualized support. Today, I'm here to share my concerns regarding returning the Futures classroom to on-site setting. Per the CDPH, when participating in a public setting, the only way to protect from COVID-19 transmission is through social distancing and wearing masks. Most of our students are unable to wear masks or social distance due to their needs. In addition, students in our classroom need specialized care, such as personal care, and are not able to social distance. Finally, our students are in the chronological age where they spread the virus similar to adults. Asking the Futures teachers to return to on-site learning in a high-risk environment is unsafe for both the students and staff. I request the board to move cautiously to protect the health of students, staff, and the community. Thank you.
A perfect 1-minute comment. Thank you. Wendy Chu, followed by Adriana Aro, followed by Brittany Irwin.
Hi, I'm a speech therapist at a district middle school. I work daily with special education students, and I implore you not to rush our special education students and staff back to campus early. We need to know that the logistics of opening in person are safely outlined before bringing back our most vulnerable population. All staff need N95 masks and access to routine COVID testing. We got notice today that a staff member at our school tested positive for COVID. Testing is crucial to preventing the spread of the virus. We need to make sure all staff have access to routine COVID testing before bringing back our most acute students who are the most vulnerable to this virus. Until we have access to testing, special education staff and students should not return in person before the general education population does on October 12th at the earliest. We should not be risking the health and safety and lives of our educators and students. We are all in this together. Please move cautiously to protect students, educators, and the public community.
Thank you. Okay, Adriana Aro, followed by Brittany Irwin, followed by Emily Kingshill.
Good evening. I am a teacher at Gunn High School. I'm a sister to a local tech worker, and I am a concerned community member. Until it is safe for our family members to return to offices, it is not safe for our children to return to school. My brother works for a large, prolific multinational corporation here in Silicon Valley. Most of us carry a device made by that company in our pockets. And since July, in an office with physical distancing, weekly testing, and limited personnel on site, he has been exposed to COVID 3 times. If a multi-billion-dollar company cannot keep their employees safe, I wonder how our school district can do so. Without weekly testing, billions of dollars, or a clear safety plan, PAUSD cannot keep our community safe. And until it does, we must not ask our colleagues or students to return to schools and in order to best support our most vulnerable students. We're fighting this virus together, and we must move forward cautiously in order to protect our students, our educators, and the community. Thank you.
Thank you. Brittany Irwin, Emily Kingshill, and Corinne Headley.
Hi, my name is Brittany, and I'm the futures teacher at JLS. I wanted to express my concern for the return to in-person learning for special education students and ask the district to please provide their plan for returning to teachers, students, and their families. Based on the most recent guidelines from the state, I will be expected to return with my entire class, my staff, and 5 additional service providers that will pull students out of my room each day. That will allow for anywhere between 15 to 19 people in and out of my cohort. I make my classroom an emotionally and physically safe place for all of my students and staff. If we were all placed in a single classroom with such high numbers, I would not be able to ensure the safety of my students and staff as I have always done. Please consider the same date for a return to in-person instruction as the general education students. There are many complexities to consider when bringing any student on campus. Our most severely impacted students deserve a thoughtful and considerate plan to ensure a quality educational experience and that all safety precautions are in place and executed well. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Emily Kingshill, Corinne Headley, and Sandy Conklin.
Hello, I'm a special education service provider at every grade level. I'd like to start by thanking each of you for your thoughtful and careful consideration regarding our return to in-person learning. Truthfully, I am very concerned about returning to campus and providing in-person services during a pandemic. All service providers see students in multiple classes or cohorts, and some service providers even see students across school sites. Some of us have heard that once students on our caseloads return to campus, we are to see students across cohorts in person. I understand this was decided after reviewing guidance put forth by the state, but I implore you to consider a more conservative stance. We know that service providers seeing students across classes, cohorts, or sites puts our students, community, and all staff that come into contact with those students receiving in-person services at unnecessary risk. Without regular testing, service providers could spread the virus across multiple cohorts without knowing it. Please postpone the return of in-person instruction. When we do return, please.
I'm sorry, the timer ran out, and you can send additional comments to us by email at board@pausd.org. Corinne Headley, Sandy Conklin, and Ian Wilson. Corinne, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
We do.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm a mother. I'm an aunt to a child with severe disabilities. I became a teacher to empower students to advocate for their needs. I believe in leading by example. I believe in science. I follow the recommendations for social distancing, mask wearing, doing whatever I can to keep myself and others safe. I miss the hugs of my parents. My daughter missed the hugs of her grandparents for 3 months. This summer, my child's teacher tested positive for COVID. She was asymptomatic. My insurance, provided by the district, I'm a teacher at Pally in special education, refused to test us. Right now, we're talking about sending our special ed kids to school. We need to carefully consider what we are asking. We need to have testing. We need to have safety protocols in place. We need to do everything in our power to consider that we are all in this together. Please proceed cautiously and with care.
Thank you. Sandy Conklin, next Ian Wilson, and then initials BG. Sandy, are you there?
Oh, I'm here.
Oh, good.
Hi, my name is Sandy Conklin, and I am the teacher of the Futures program at Gunn. In addition, I'm a mother and a daughter and a sibling. Mr. Collins has seen my class in action at the Principal's Coffee. I'd like to start by saying my students' health and safety, as well as my family, is my #1 priority. General ed and special ed teachers realize that distance learning works for some better than it does others. There's good reviews on both sides. However, we're in the middle of a pandemic and don't have the luxury of life as normal. As educators, let's follow science. Social distancing, masks, no confined spaces. This is not possible at this time with our classes. I don't want to be your canary in the minefield, nor do I want my 90-year-old parents to be collateral damage to a rush to in-person learning. We're all in this together. Move cautiously to protect all of us. You are meeting as a board virtually because of science. Give us the same consideration, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Ian Wilson, initials BG, and then Terry, last initial M.
Hello, board members. My name is Ian Wilson. I'm a Pally class of 2009 alum. I'm here as part of a group of alumni who are committed to holding the school board and the district accountable to its promises to implement anti-racist practices in PAUSD. I would urge the board to be aware that in recent discussions with alumni of PAUSD spanning a period of almost 20 years, including graduates of the class of 2019, it is apparent that the marginalization of our minority students, and in particular our Black, Latinx, and Pacific Islander communities, remains rampant, especially at the elementary and middle school levels. This is an extraordinarily difficult time for the district, but I would urge you at all times to keep in mind that fighting for equality for our students is a matter of constant empathetic thought. It is not enough to say that you want to see improvements in the experience or academic metrics of all those underprivileged students. You need to take concrete steps towards seeing that systemic change, and we need to financially support programs that strive to empower these students and communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Initials BG, and then Terry M, and then Ellie Sandus.
Thank you very much. I would like to applaud the previous speaker's comments. I agree 100% with them. My name is Brian. I am born and raised Palo Alto native in the apricot orchards off of Wilkie Way. I graduated from Gunn High School in 1999, so I am extremely passionate about Palo Alto. I have dedicated my life to serving the underserved, specifically special education, as a special education teacher for the last 12 years in Palo Alto. I am very hesitant in believing that we are going back, believing in science, believing in everything that science has told us, when just a week and a half ago, we found that there was a positive test at one of the elementary schools where some of my staff members have also been exposed, and there was no notification system whatsoever at all. So until we come up with a concrete plan with systematic steps where we all know exactly what to expect,
Thank you. Next is Terry M, Ellie Sandus, and then Sunny Lou.
Hello, my name is Terry McBride. I've been with the IT department at Palo Alto for 8 years. I want to raise a concern of the communication of positive COVID tests. Today, I was told, I don't know if it's a rumor or not, and that's where my problem is, that at Pally, a custodian's wife tested positive. He was negative, but I'm in and out of that office helping the custodians. They come into my office, which I share with another IT person, and I don't know if I should be scared, if I should stay home or what, because I have not had anything emailed to me. I haven't had any communication, and I am the father of 3 kids are under 5 years old. My in-laws who are in their late 60s watch my kids. I'm high risk, but as IT, I'm told I need to come in every day to make sure everything has happened, which I'm okay with, but I want to raise the concern with just the communication and when I should or should not be going in. Thank you.
Thank you. Eli or Ellie Sandus, tell me which one. Sunny Lou and Elo N.
My name is Ellie Sandus. Thanks for trying to pronounce it. I appreciate that. I'm the EL coordinator at JLS. I'm also an alumnus of the district. I went to Nixon, JLS, and Gunn, and I'm proud to teach here. I really appreciate a lot of the things that the district does for us. I would love for us to think more creatively about how to serve our historically underserved students. Better than what we're thinking about with PAUSD Plus, possibly with mentoring programs and increasing funding for access to working online for those students so that they have the same access and opportunities that other students have. In addition, I have grave concerns about coming back to campus as the EL and teaching in the EL program. We are not able to maintain stable cohorts, and I and my colleagues are really afraid that when we have students from all grades at JLS, we're mixing with the entire school and there's no purpose in having cohorts.
Thank you. Sunny Lou, Elo N, and Lisa, last initial J.
Hello, my name is Sunny Liu, and I'm a parent at Hoover Elementary. Happy birthday, Dr. Austin. You are actually 17 years younger than Hoover's classrooms. Dr. Austin, in the recent newsletter, states that Hoover's construction is a priority, and the board will be revisiting bids in January. My questions are, what will happen in January, and what can we as a community to expect? If Hoover's construction is a priority, why will the board not seeking rebids now or negotiate with the bidders? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Elo, last initial N, Lisa, last initial J, and Trish Jemison.
Can you hear me?
We do.
Okay, I'm a speech therapist and parent of a child with special needs. Distance learning has been very effective for most of my students, as was highlighted at 2 non-severe IEPs this week. To make 1 minute, here are bullet points. Speech is an aerosol activity. There's not enough time in a school day to change to one-on-one services for returning students, thus depriving them of group interaction and causing other groups to be too big to meet their IEP goals. It will require contracting out. Seeing faces virtually is more effective than seeing them through masks 6 feet apart for articulation, voice fluency, and facial cues. I alone serves 50 children in 17 classrooms. That's 34 cohorts. And we specialists also work at 2 to 12 sites for cross-contamination. The director wisely told specialists to schedule students on their non-school hybrid days so they won't miss their in-person instruction. The specialist services are best delivered via remote teaching to have safe and targeted programs for students without subtracting from in-person class time. We are all in this together. Move cautiously to protect students, educators, and the public community. Thank you.
Thank you. Lisa J, Trish Jemison, and Eric Bloom.
Hi, my name is Lisa Jorge, and I'm a futures teacher at Green Middle School. I've been a special education teacher in the district for 11 years. When I say I love what I do, I mean it. I've listened to the board meetings since May. I, along with my fellow futures team, have written to you, the board, the SPED director, and superintendent about concerns relating to reopening. We heard zero response. You can imagine the concerns we have when we hear we are to be back in person from the local newspaper. We have asked to be part of the plan since May. You can imagine the concern we have when we talk to staff who worked ESY and they shared large concerns about safety. We have asked to be part of the plan since May. You can imagine the concerns we have when we have parents asking us about phase 1 and 2 and we are left to say we don't know. We've asked to be part of the plan since May. I ask to be part of the plan now. Reopening on September 21st without involving the direct teachers on the front line is negligent and hurtful. We are all in this together. Move cautiously to protect students, staff, and public community.
Thank you. Trish Jemison, Eric Bloom, and Celeste Thomas.
Hi there, my name's Trish and I'm a parent of a special ed student at Green. I had a bunch of comments ready, but based on some of the comments I've already heard thus far, I'm really, really concerned even more than I was before. I cannot believe a staff member has tested positive and that there was no transparency with families of the students who are expected to be going back first. The high-risk students, such as my daughter, that how can in-person learning be safe for a child that needs one-on-one help closer than 6 feet, such as toileting? And by the same token, how is that safe for the instructor being exposed to bodily fluids? And I don't feel safe for my child to return to school. So who is going to instruct her? And please have some communication with families. And I really beg of you, please communicate with us. We're so confused.
Thank you. Eric Bloom, Celeste Thomas, and Sarah Woodham.
Thank you. I am a Pali teacher, the father of 2 Pali graduates, the son of a Pali graduate, and a resident of the community. I like to first heartfeltly give my support to our SPED teachers for their consistent delivery of services well beyond what their contract requires. And I think it's really important to understand that these are teachers that have already give more than what's being expected. I also would like to offer some advice from William Shakespeare. Wisely and slow, they stumble that run fast. Amid this time, we really need some cautious and some wise planning and discussion in the open so that we can understand what this life is going to be like when we come back. Currently, I meet my students 3 times a week. In a new hybrid phase, I would only see them once a week. Thank you.
Thank you. Celeste Thomas, Sarah Woodham, and Morgan Greenlaw.
Hi, my name is Celeste Thomas, and I'm a futures teacher at Pali. I love our students and I love our program. We acknowledge the challenges of COVID. It's been hard on all of us. With that said, as we hear the plans about reopening of our classroom, I feel deeply saddened to hear that my colleagues and I have not been included in the planning process. We've reached out to the district admin as well as the board and have heard nothing back. I spend my days and nights planning for our students, and to know that my input and feedback is not of importance to decision makers is disheartening. Do you want to know what I miss most about my job? Seeing my students, greeting them off the bus each morning, giving them a high five after a job well done, crossing the street with them during community outings. All of these are not feasible within 6 feet apart. What will our program look like when we return to campus? The health and safety of this population matters. The health and safety of all of my colleagues matters. We are in this together. Move cautiously to protect students, staff, and public community.
Thank you. Sarah Woodham, Morgan Greenlaw, and Sherry Mulrow.
Hi. As I read the superintendent update last Friday, I was pleased that it included actions and progress around dismantling inequity to improve outcomes. I thought then that we would see the return of the equity snapshot, or there would be an agendized item to follow up. The update is essentially one-way push-out information delivery, which is fine for what it is. But board meetings are about governance, transparency, and accountability around this and other types of information. Without an agendized item, we don't get to ask questions, and I had lots of questions. We don't get to listen to board discussion. We don't get to understand what the superintendent and staff are expecting to get out of this work, and what effect we should expect it to have on our children in the classroom. Please let's get equity back on the agenda on a regular basis, given the pressing need that it deserves. Thanks.
Thank you. Morgan Greenlaw, Sherry Mulrow, and then the last speaker will be Jeannie Lithcott.
Hi, can you hear me?
We do.
Okay. I'm a sophomore at Pali, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen to my concerns about the current Monday schedule. The problem with this schedule is that having all 7 classes on one day in only 30-minute blocks does not leave enough time to actually dive deep enough into a subject to learn something, yet we still get assigned homework in almost every class. This leaves us staying up late at night in order to finish the homework we have due on Tuesday, which is incredibly draining. I think that the schedule should be changed so that one day a week is asynchronous and the other days have 3 or 4 classes. This will give us enough class time to learn from the lecture and discuss with our peers, as well as limit the amount of homework we get assigned on a single day. As the only public school district in the area that is synchronous every day, implementing this new asynchronous schedule would benefit students and staff. Thank you.
Thank you. Sherry Mulrow and then Ginny Lithcott.
Hi there, can you hear me?
We do.
I am a teacher at Pali. Our special education colleagues and students should not return in person before the general education population, period. We are in this together, move cautiously to protect students, educators, and the public community. Additionally, I'm very concerned about the current 5-day synchronous schedule. It is not good for kids to be on a computer screen all day, every day. I propose that we make that day a fully asynchronous day for students as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. And then our last speaker on this will be Ginny Lithcott.
Am I live? Can you hear me?
We can. Why don't you wait 1 second and we'll reset the timer so you get your full minute.
Okay, thank you.
All right, go ahead, Jeannie.
Hi, my name is Jean Lithcott. I'm a lifelong science educator in high schools and universities all across the world. I have enormous empathy for what everyone is facing right now with respect to schooling. I'm also a member of a Black family, and I want to speak tonight about the state's current findings and worries that in PAUSD, a disproportionate number of Black and Latinx students have been in special education classes for at least 3 years in a row. And also that Superintendent Austin said he expects to see that finding for the next several years because it's not practical to take students out of special education. It will take time for this situation to cycle through. Each of those Black and Latino kids who have been over-identified as special needs does not have time to wait for even another day for the education they ought to have been having all along. The superintendent and school board must find a way to begin now to put right what has been wrong for Black, Latino, and Pacific Islander youngsters for so long. It's immoral.
Thank you. And you can send any additional comments to board@pausd.org. And with that, we will move on to, we'll go back to item 2C, Capital Advisors Legislative Update. Dr. Austin.
Okay, so Mr. Gordon's punishment for not being here in the very beginning is he's going to have to just assume that I said very nice things about him in my original introduction. So Kevin Gordon, so thankful you're with us here tonight to go through some pieces of legislation and interpretation of that legislation, and maybe even some forward thinking on where things are going. And as always, appreciate your time. So with that, I will turn it over to Kevin Gordon.
Superintendent Austin, members of the board, it's a pleasure to be with you. And I actually think it was extremely helpful to hear all of those comments. It's a really good thing for us to hear it. We're trying to be the voice of Palo Alto Unified up at the Capitol building and express some of the work. And I honestly try to actually portray some of the concerns, anxieties, and other issues that have been expressed by so many of the speakers tonight. One of the things that I just wanted to start out with, because I haven't been before the board for a while, is the frustration that all of us in K-12 public education have felt, frankly, from at the state. And that is that it was one of those situations where the legislature, I mean, sort of the chronology is that the legislature felt very strongly that at the outset of the virus and the reaction by the governor to go ahead and ensure that everybody basically got their funding. And they had a policy where everyone gets paid whether you're in front of kids or not. And we're talking about every aspect of K-12 education. And that we were going to do our level best to serve the needs of kids the way, the very best way people could, that there was a big disappointment by the legislature in the aftermath of that sort of experiment, if you will, or the circumstances we were tossed into in the springtime in terms of the quality of the education that a lot of kids got. Now, Palo Alto really stepped up to the plate, I think, in a big way, but there were a lot of places, there are a lot of examples that I could mention here of school districts that it wouldn't have been something you would have wanted from a babysitter, let alone education, some of the things going on in public schools across the state. And the legislature was really upset about it. And they actually had a really, probably a wrong-headed overreaction to it, which was to pass a budget act, which was SB 98, which, you know, I think there's many of the boards are familiar with the content of SB 98. But one of the things that was, you know, obviously about that piece of legislation was that it put a premium on the idea that we're going to bring kids back and we're going to have in-person instruction. And that if you're not going to have in-person instruction, by God, there's going to be a whole lot of accountability for you. And there are going to be financial consequences for school districts. Well, it just as they were headed toward a very determined direction about in-person instruction, well, many of the people in this community have talked about their very legitimate fears, and we're talking about staff and students, about the exposure and, I mean, legitimate reasons why people might not want to come to campus. And then the numbers started to skyrocket with regard to the spread of the virus. And all of our elected friends up in Sacramento boomeranged in the complete opposite direction all of a sudden, and they jerked around public schools with it, which is to say, oh, maybe we ought not be doing that. And there was such a tamping down on the idea that we might actually just do some distance learning, that made good public policy sense, rather than bringing everybody back to in-person instruction. The superintendent and I were on the phone almost every single day. I mean, we were comparing notes, trying to get intel from decision makers in Sacramento who couldn't really just decide something. And it was just a terrible place to be when, in fact, we've got a job to do in terms of serving the community and making sure that we've got something to serve kids with. So then they go in this direction of, okay, maybe we just need to do the distance learning thing or some kind of a hybrid. And we set out in that direction. And then we get more policy, which is, hey, why don't we bring some kids back in small groups? And who might those kids be? And defining what that was going to be. Obviously, the legislature did that. Then they did the policy that said, you know, the governor followed up with a policy that said, hey, if you're in elementary school, you can go get a waiver and bring kids back, you know, obviously with certain kinds of conditions. But all of it was just constantly contradicting the policy of the prior week. Is just craziness. And so through all of that, we've had to try to make sense of this. And I think what you have, and honestly, Palo Alto has kind of been a leader statewide, written about a lot in newspapers all across the state about its effort to try to constantly recalibrate in order to serve the best interests of kids. And so now we get to a model that is really punitive to school districts if you're not trying to figure out ways to make sure we're addressing the needs of kids with disabilities in person, some kind of small learning groups. And so I really hear so many of the folks that have raised concerns about what are we exposing staff to, what are exposing kids with disabilities to, but it's very clearly the intent of the legislature and the governor that you're going to make an effort, you're going to evaluate the prudence of bringing kids back in small groups, kids that are either kids with disability, kids that have learning loss, whatever the reason might be, but that there are some kids where it might be appropriate to come back. And obviously, not without some sensibility to what that policy is. That is everything that you would have in mind with regard to doing it safely. And then, of course, above all, people that are not comfortable coming back, whether you're a student or a staff, respecting your rights and your concerns about those kinds of circumstances. So people have done their level best. I'm a little off topic, but I wanted to mention that because just at the outset, the district, not unlike school districts all across the state, has really been jerked around a lot. And for the parents that feel like, and the teachers that feel like, when do I get engaged? I'm telling you, we could put quote marks around your very concerns about the lack of engagement to listen to what the superintendent has said to state officials. when do we get our turn to be heard? And he is finally, the superintendent has gotten in a position now where state leaders are actually trying to listen to his input. And I think it's having a really great impact on policy. So there have been some things that they're actually rethinking as a result of some of the input that they've gotten from the superintendent, the leadership of the district. So I just wanted to start with that. I've got a number of other topics here, but I really want to respect the board president and the members of the board, that if you guys want to inject comments or questions along the way as I go through some of these topics, I'm totally welcome to hear that. Next, I was going to talk about the liability issue and some of these legislative update issues, but any thoughts or comments about sort of some of the direction thing? I think, and taking it out of order, I suggested some items that I was going to talk about, but one of the things I was going to talk about was the passage of the cleanup bill, the budget cleanup bill, which is related to this issue. And I would just
say, why don't you push ahead and go through your stuff, and then we'll come around for comments after.
Okay, good. So on SB 820, this is the cleanup legislation. Again, this legislation, as they put it's sort of the cleanup to the budget bill well after a budget was passed, does indeed sort of reinforce some of the issues that the legislature wants to make sure with regard to accountability on what we're doing with synchronous and asynchronous. And actually they're getting into public schools business, if you will, regarding asynchronous instruction in a way we've kind of never seen before. And again, it is a backlash to them being worried about, to policymakers in Sacramento being worried about what they saw in the springtime, which is when you have a significant amount of synchronous instruction, you actually gird against some of the concerns they would otherwise have with the asynchronous stuff. But on the asynchronous, it's these learning logs that are just ridiculous in terms of what they ask for in detail for every single kid and the nature of what they want. And we're trying to work through that with the state. But a lot of that's set forth in terms of the accountability between what the Budget Act did and also the cleanup legislation in its mission to sort of tie up some of the loose ends. There is more to do on this. The governor, the administration may step in and do more. We may see more guidance on this relative to what we're supposed to do, relative to the accountability piece and the things that we're going to be doing in terms of operating public schools going forward. So I wanted to touch base on that. That obviously was passed. It has not been signed yet by the governor. There was a major issue with regard to liability. You know, school districts, we were hoping to get legislation passed that did not protect schools from gross negligence or decisions that would inappropriately do things that would infect kids or the community or whatever, but generally speaking, not have a presumption that in fact, if there was an outbreak or if a student or a staff member ended up getting it, the presumption would automatically be, well, it's the school's fault. We wanted to get some sort of protection from liability on that for public schools across the state that would be limited and then also would sunset at some point in the not too distant future in terms of this year, next year. And that legislation did not end up even getting a hearing in the legislature. And I think part of the problem that clouded it was that business interests all around the state are trying to get a release of liability as well for COVID-related illness issues with regard to whatever it is they might do to just follow local public health orders. Is that if the state Department of Public Health and county health are giving guidance and they want you to go in a certain direction, and we have legislation that pushes us in a direction to bring kids back at some point, that the liability needs to be shared with or carried by those who would put policies forward like that. But again, that legislation not passed. So that then the issue moves sort of to the stage in Washington, D.C. over the debate over a fifth round of stimulus, which is going on right now. If Republicans are going to go along with any kind of a spending bill, one of the asks that they have, mostly pushed with regard to private sector and business interests, but they've articulated very clearly their intent to want to include public education in this, which would be a broad relief of liability relative to COVID-19. So we'll see what happens with that particular issue, but I wanted to let you know what was going on with that. Then there's the passage of AB 331 by Jose Medina. This is the bill that would mandate ethnic studies, a course in ethnic studies. And what it does is it mandates that we will have a course, and there are courses that you guys might even have, but there's going to be options for what might qualify as a course. There'll be an outline of expectations of what those courses could look like. So there could be coursework that you have in any number of types of topics that would count toward this. But a course does have to be offered by 2025-26, that school year. And then students cannot graduate from high school in California without meeting the graduation requirement of having met that by the 2029-30 school year. So I wanted to mention, you know, there's going to be obviously a lot of guidance on this. There's a framework, as many people probably are aware, that's been developed by the state of California. One earlier one that was quite controversial. There's been follow-up work on a framework that's gotten a lot more support. The California State Board of Education has more work to do in this area, but there'll be guidance given as to what those courses are going to be looking like and what's going to be required. But yes, that mandate now is coming. And now I should say, qualify that to say, the governor has yet to sign the bill. I expect him to sign the bill. And if and when the governor does sign the bill, then that's when that mandate will go into effect. And obviously lots of time between the 25-26 school year to get that in place. So that's on that particular. The other development that we've been real involved with, we convened a call with the Undersecretary of Agriculture right at the outset of everything that happened relative to COVID-19. And we're talking about broad waivers. Obviously, we got waivers into the springtime just to make sure all kids got fed and that we wouldn't be in violation of very prescriptive laws around school lunch and school meal programs. And they waived all of that. And then, you know, one of the things I've always asserted is that if we spent less time worrying about the kid who has a meal that might not be qualified for that meal and just fed all kids that wanted to eat the food that we serve in schools, we had to just give it to them, and we would probably save money over the bureaucracy that chases down the kid that maybe shouldn't have the meal. And so we're going to get a real good experiment in that, because we've had that be the case, and a waiver was just extended by the Secretary of Agriculture, who was basically telling us as of the last couple of months that he wasn't going to do it, and he wanted to see Congress take action. Well, we were hoping to put sort of a trailer on a stimulus bill if another bill had gone through. And when the negotiations broke down, we had to find another way. So then we put language into what is called the Agricultural Appropriations Bill that was moving through the House of Representatives. That wasn't looking like it was going to get acted on anytime soon, particularly that provision. And then the Secretary, I think, seeing the reality that there was not going to be a legislative solution in Congress, decided he's got the authority, he has the power to act, and he did end up extending those waivers on his own, which was a good thing. So that gets us through the calendar year this year, and then we would have to have Congress act, and we suspect Congress will take that action for the remainder of the school year to the degree we think it's necessary, which I think it probably will be. And then I wanted to mention a little bit on sort of the financial updates. Is the California Department of Finance has not issued an update since kind of their look back on the first month of the new fiscal year, which was July. So we haven't gotten a report yet on how August looked, but we know that for the first month of the fiscal year, looking back, that we ended up being $2.5 billion ahead of what the estimates were on the very budget that they had just passed. Obviously, that's good news, because it's how far are we ahead of the assumptions, sort of the draconian assumptions that they were making in what the outlook was for school finance. You know, we obviously have a whole lot of months left to this fiscal year, and so we'll see how all of this shakes out. I'm more worried about sort of the long term than I am the short run, especially if Congress does not end up doing a stimulus package that ends up helping California. We need support in two areas. One is the governor was hoping that California would net out about $14 billion of its share of whatever federal package might be put together. And if we got to that number, we could then relook at the deferrals that are happening for school districts up and down the state. So now what we're looking at is obviously, if we don't get that share of money, I mean, it's going to impact obviously state resources, and sort of we end up having to shoulder all of the deferrals. What we're hoping to do is actually carve back on some of the deferrals or the degree to which the governor is letting money out to LEAs across the state. And obviously, to the extent that we do get some support from the state of California, we're obviously going to have an impact relative to some of that money. So I do think now, I tend to be very optimistic that I think we're going to end up getting a smaller package out of Congress. And to the extent that we get both an education piece and that second piece I was talking about is support for states, support for state and local governments. So if there ends up being a component for both, and it's that state and local piece of stimulus funding that is really where the big differences exist in Congress. But if we get money out of both pots, that will probably put California into pretty good shape. And while we know the president doesn't seem too interested in trying to help California out these days, or any state that he considers obviously a blue state, Congress has to try to make decisions for what's going to go on for the whole country. And I think at the end of the day, the pressure on members of Congress on both sides, particularly on the education issue, I think will help us get over the finish line with, again, a smaller package. Who knows what that dollar amount will be, but obviously some degree of stimulus will be helpful. So that's kind of the update for now. I do want to mention that, again, the state of California is operating based on these deferrals, which is essentially borrowing money from next year's budget. And they have no idea what next year's budget's going to look like. What happened the last time this happened when Jerry Brown did it, he had to actually borrow from the next year's budget after that. So there were succeeding years of borrowing that happened, and that really cranked up the overall burden that schools were borrowing way out on that limb, till we got to a point where the economy was growing again enough to pay down or pay back essentially all of those deferrals. And we never ended up having to do those cuts that were sort of teetering on the edge of that deferral deal. Well, we're replicating that again. The difference is we don't have a Jerry Brown in Sacramento. Many people characterize him as the adult in the room, who would spend $10 billion to retire an accounting gimmick. We need to make sure there's that leadership there, that as the economy gets better, hoping that of course occurs as quickly as possible, that the first order of business is to obviously knock down some of these deferrals. That would be a really, really important thing. So we'll see what happens with it. But what it says is a cautionary note. And then for the district, whether it's property taxes or other sources of revenue, including the implications of Prop 15 on the ballot, which can have a negative effect overall property tax revenues into the future. We just have to be really careful about where we're headed from a financial standpoint. So I think I'll stop there and see if we have any questions.
So board members, I'm thinking we'll do board questions and comments first, and then we've got a couple of people with hands up, and we can take public comment after, since there's no action on this item. Are there any board questions and comments? Go ahead, Melissa.
First of all, thank you, Kevin, for being here tonight. It's always good to hear from you. One of the things that has been put forward, and you didn't really talk about it, is the audit requirements for districts and what you think that's going to look like, and how hard is it going to be for us to, well, we know how, I mean, the way it's written right now, it seems like it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to conform with. And I wonder if you could talk to that.
No, that's such a great question. You guys always end up asking the questions of the things where, they say the best features are when you're driving away, all the stuff you forget about. So that's a really great question, because it points up something that we're really engaged in. The superintendent's been really aware of this. One of the things that we thought immediately when we started seeing all the implications of these two pieces of legislation, the main trailer bill for the budget that we had when the Budget Act was passed, as well as this follow-up legislation, was what are the implications of audits? And so everybody understands this. There are gotchas in this legislation that says, if you don't do it exactly the way they expect you to do it, there are going to be penalties against districts. And that they had cited a very broad range of the trailer bill that would be subject to audits. One of the major changes that was put into SB 820 really important, was a very small little change that said that where the audits would be subject to quote unquote this part. And when we use that language, we're talking about a huge chunk of the Trader bill. That got changed to this section. So it closes down on what those audits would be applicable to. It's still a lot of stuff. So then what we did is we went to the state controller, Betty Yee, and we talked to Betty Yee, who had not been around in that office when we had some pretty ugly audits done more than a couple decades ago on attendance that were just simply unfair. It was a situation where when 90% of the districts getting audited are having major problems, then that means it's a problem of state policy. It's not a problem with the school districts. It means they wrote something that was flawed when the overwhelming majority of districts have the same problem. These audits should be actually going after what would be outliers and unique circumstances where people didn't step up and do what they needed to do. And right now we're headed for a major problem if in fact the way the audit guide is put together isn't done so carefully. So for purposes of the audience, people watching this, is that what happens is on audits, every district in the state has to undergo an outside independent audit every year, and the governing board here is very well aware of that. Well, when that outside independent auditor comes in, they're actually predicating what they're looking for based on an annual guide produced by the state controller. That annual audit guide drives what these auditors, sometimes very inexperienced young auditors who come in, and they hold on to that guide and they look for everything that's in it. Well, the audit guide, obviously, there's going to be a modified audit guide for 1920. And then there's going to be a full audit guide process, producing an audit guide for the following year. And those are the years we're real concerned about making sure that the supplement for the year that has closed and the new audit guide go through a process where we're able to inform the controller about things that we think actually wouldn't be easy to audit. They would be not an auditable thing. And that if an auditor went in and said, look, the law is too fuzzy here for me to say whether a district was or wasn't in compliance. So let's try to leave some of the things in an audit guide that are the right things to be holding school districts accountable for. So some of the areas that I mentioned earlier that we've been working on is this issue of these logs, is that when you listen to Linda Darling-Hammond, the president of the State Board of Education, she really gets it. I mean, she said, look, at the intent here was for us to broadly say, if we have cohorts of students that are generally doing the same thing when they're doing the asynchronous part of their instruction, then let's record that in big groups and have some way to make that recording of that in terms of the record, so that an auditor comes in, you can say, look, at this class did this, was assigned this, but not this sort of excruciating detail of every single kid with a different kind of set of entries that if you didn't do that right, you're going to get hung up, and the penalty is very significant, can be in the millions of dollars of what a district might lose. So we have engaged the controller. She has been totally committed to a process, as well as, by the way, the state superintendent, Tony Thurman, because the California Department of Education is very involved with this process as well. So these two constitutional officers have let us put together a group, an advisory group, that's going to help shape what in fact ends up going into that audit guide. And there's a number of players that have a role at the table. We put together a call with the controller, and we hosted it with the representatives of CSBA, AXA, CASBO, the school business officials, a number of folks that now all have a seat at that table. And then we have Jerry Shelton, who's the founding partner of our organization, who was the deputy state superintendent CFO under Jack O'Connell, and knows that process really well. He's engaged with not real formally, but pulling that group together. But he becomes a great resource for the group for a lot of people who hadn't seen some of the audit problems that we've seen in the past, and can really educate them on. So long answer to a really important short question. I appreciate it.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yes.
Todd, are we just going to go around with questions, or I may have another one, but I can wait.
Okay, let's see if somebody else has one, and then we can come back. Other questions for Mr. Gordon? I actually have one, and let me pull way back. So looking into your crystal ball, what is the expectation in terms of state funding to school districts like ours, basic aid districts next year?
Yeah.
You're going to see a reduction in funding.
Yeah, I think your issues are going to be more the implications not of the state legislature or the governor doing anything. I think it's more a product of what's going on with local property taxes and property tax policy. So, and I do think there are some danger signs there that we got.
Yeah, so let me ask, because you said something that I thought was interesting, that Prop 15 could negatively impact revenue.
Right.
Obviously, Prop 15 is meant to increase revenue. And I believe that our allocation for that is like $100 per ADA, which would be about $1 million for us.
Right.
What's the expectation? What's the thinking about how it will reduce revenue?
Well, the concern that we've always had about the ballot measure is that the way the ballot measure works is that it would basically say going forward that there's an increment of property tax that's, that is going to be dedicated now and then put back out to the community for purposes of supporting public schools. And when it does it, it disproportionately gives that money, as you know, not to basic aid districts, but to other districts. And when it does it, if it redistributes money that you otherwise would have gotten a certain share of, in terms of the growth of property tax revenue out of commercial and industrial property, it's going to limit the growth that you would otherwise have had. So the question is, honestly, I'm just being really blunt here, the measly, I think it's $100 an ADA that you would get as a result of this is, in my view, very likely not going to keep up with the amount that I think you could stand to actually not gain, that you'll have growth over years in the future that you won't get. So everybody talks about what is today and what your share is of what is. They don't talk about the sacrifice of what you lose in growth in future years. And that's what I'm concerned about for basic aid districts.
And the one other thing I can think of in that, and I don't know, tell me if this is something that you've thought about, is that, I mean, right now, property values in the commercial sector reflect the current tax regime. And if the taxes on those properties go up, then the values of the properties are going to fall. I mean, that's just math.
Right.
If buyers expect they're going to pay more taxes in the future than they would have otherwise, then the values are going to fall. If the values fall, those people will apply for relief, get property tax adjustments, and that will negatively impact our. That's likely to happen?
Part of the calculus of what we have been contemplating is that, so when I say, it's a perennial fight in Sacramento, and every now and then it rears its ugly head, where there are folks that are sort of looking for who can we go pick on relative to, basic aid districts. And the general philosophy of basic aid districts as a coalition has been hide, just don't make a big deal about yourselves, because the legislature might be inclined to try to figure out a way, how do we take your money away from you? I just don't see that. I mean, maybe there could be some sort of a resurgence in some quarters of the Capitol building where someone might raise that issue. And we do see that, but I don't think there's enough traction to get something legitimately going in that area. So I'm confident that you guys will be okay on that front. But the very issues you've mentioned, I think, are the more serious issues that we need to be contemplating some sort of reductions in local revenue that could happen. And really an imperative for the community to think about how big is education as a priority in the community. And for Palo Alto and the community, education has always been a major priority. The key is that to the extent that when we go out and ask for the community support, are they there? Are they there for you? And hopefully that'll be the case. That'll continue to be the case, because that's the way you're going to shore up these revenue situations. And if for some reason they weren't there when you go to the ballot, it just exacerbates your own fiscal circumstances.
Thank you. Melissa, did you want to ask your other question?
Yeah, my question is about the digital divide. I mean, I think the move to distance learning has raised the visibility of what the divide really is across California. And one thing that is concerning me is that it seems like local communities and counties are looking at this as a one-time problem and trying to raise money for appliances and Wi-Fi hotspots, but really we have a problem at a deeper level that, you know, internet has become really something that everybody needs, not just for education, but for being able to work. Right. And yet it's not a utility. There's not ubiquitous access to it like there is other things like telephone service. Right. And so I'm just wondering what's happening at the Capitol on this. Are there any conversations? Because if this is just like every year, it's going to be a one time, let's just raise money so that we can fill in the gaps. I don't think we're ever going to get on top of it.
Yeah, I think there is really a very definite, palpable commitment by leaders really on both sides of the aisle to say, this is no longer sort of this luxury or innovation that we get to play with. This is an essential, that the idea of devices and connectivity and an architecture for going forward with regard to digital capacity is as essential as a book has been for, you know, many, many, many decades, right? And so in California public schools that we've got to get there. And one of the things that's sort of not so understood, even though we've got now, you know, the lion's share of $5.3 billion of assistance that's going to be pumped out to school districts across the state. And by the way, I'll mention that Palo Alto does not get a fair share of that money by any means. I mean, every kid and every classroom is impacted by COVID. And while we absolutely know the data and the research with it when it comes to kids of color and kids in poverty, no question about it, we've got a big challenge there. And we see that digital divide there too. So it's totally legitimate for us to make sure that the system is tilted that way. But it's not appropriate when you have very big chunks of the money that bypass, you know, many, many kids in many, many districts across the state completely. And so we need to have a little more balance when it comes to that. But again, they are saying that when they look at this $5.3 billion of money that's going out, in addition to that, the $1.6 billion of what was the CARES Act funding that we went out under Title I, basically a Title I formula, that these dollars overwhelmingly should be focused on the issue of the digital divide and digital capacity. And it is a lot there. And I don't know if you guys caught this, but the Lottery Act, which has always had a special set aside of funds for instructional materials, was amended by SB 820 so that that instructional material fund, jealously guarded by publishers, textbook publishers, has now gotten basically cracked open so it can be used for devices and connectivity. And that's an ongoing source. What I think you're going to see is the legislature now and the governor moving a little bit away from LCFF to say, instead of LCFF being putting a premium on collapsing categoricals and essentially telling you that that bag of money over there, the general bag of money, get whatever you need out of that. And not doing categoricals, which would be really important to a district like Palo Alto, that now we're going to think a resurgence of, you know, we do need a separate pot of money that helps the state address the issue of digital capacity in schools for the long term as its own categorical. It's got to get funded, and there's got to get money out to the field that's not just one-time money, which is what we see the lion's share of, is just one-time money. It's here and it's gone. So you make a really important point about we need to see systemic long-term investment in this issue. The other thing there needs to be a sort of recognition of is that there are kids in all kinds of corners of the state of California who money doesn't even get you the connectivity. They can't get connected. And it's because of how remote those areas are. And what we've got to sort of grapple with is how do you offer up a digital assignment to somebody and not have an obligation to ensure that every single kid has access to that, and not just a rule, but an infrastructure that supports it. And they need to do that. So it's a real serious question. I think the legislature is taking it very seriously, and I'm really optimistic that next year they're going to say, now what can we do to make sure that just like the investment in the buildings and instruction materials that had their own categorical for so many years. What are we doing for digital capacity?
Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, so let's, unless there are other board member comments and questions, we've got 3 hands raised and we can take care of those. So can we get the timer set up? And it'll be Kimberly Ang Lee, Naomi H, and CSEA President Meb Steiner. Kimberly, thanks for waiting.
Kimberly Ang Lee, co-chair for the Palo Alto CAC. Today, Santa Clara County moved into the red tier, and new policies return small cohorts of struggling students for essential in-person supervision and limited instruction, targeted supports, and facilitation of distance learning. PAUSD and PAEA have already predetermined that large-scale in-person instruction won't start before October 12th. But PAUSD and the collective bargaining units have also not reached agreement on addressing the needs and priorities of students with disabilities. What are the hurdles? Is it legislative or local?
Right, Kimberly, I'm sorry, is this, I'm trying to figure out, is this related to the report or is it on another item?
I'm speaking on, I have questions.
Okay, go ahead, sorry.
Students with disabilities are still protected under law, and the government hasn't stopped funding public schools. The one-size-fits-all solutions don't work for students with acute needs. Physicians and healthcare professionals determine health and safety protocols, and parents know what's going on or not for their kids at home. Despite our educators' best intentions and efforts, not all kids are experiencing distance learning favorably or equally. 2020 marks the 30th anniversary of the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. 2020 would not be the year to dismiss this landmark civil rights law, which affirms the inherent dignity of every person, regardless of ability. People with disabilities often face barriers to accessibility, inaccessible facilities and equipment, inaccurate assumptions, and in not rare cases, people are denied education because of their disabilities. PTA affirms that children with special needs have rights to services in school under federal and state laws, and the U.S. Department of Education has not waived the district's requirements under IDEA and California law and has not suggested delay. Children with disabilities rely uniquely on public entities to ensure emotional educational well-being, and students with disabilities are so vulnerable to regression that they have statutory rights to extended school year services to prevent learning loss. Who better to enforce the legitimate rights of students with disabilities than the allocator of public funds? Are there any changes in these expectations? Individual needs vary, so CAC posits that acute support may be needed in an alternative location, like in-home or in school, using different or contracted providers, although alternative means like consultative services to parents. Parents continue to be the primary champions of IDEA, and it's an undue burden for special needs parents to prove harm to their children and demonstrate regression or lost skills. So who knows the real impact of learning better than parents? If some say it's not okay, it's not okay. What does Sacramento say about acute educational needs and public funding? Palo Alto CAC is advocating for the safe, slow, phased-in return to in-person education, prioritizing protected student groups, starting with the most acute. Regardless of the date or style of reopening, do schools have different safety considerations than other industries? Can stakeholders see the safety and health plans? Are there COVID risks that can and
Thank you, and you can email additional comments to board@pausd.org. Okay, Naomi H, and then CSA President Meb Steiner, and then the last speaker will be PAEA President Terry Bolton.
Hello, I actually signed up for the open forum, so I'll be very brief here. I wanted to second many of the teachers and the staff who spoke about returning to work in special ed. Some of you know me from my ongoing concerns since a decade now about indoor air quality. But I will put it to the side just to let you know, I don't know if you're aware, I want to be wrong. As far as I know, classified employees were informed today that they are going tomorrow to students' homes. I don't know about, it's not me, so I want to clarify and to make sure that I may be wrong here. We're giving, last minute notices that they are going tomorrow to students' homes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, Meb Steiner, and then the last speaker will be Terry Bolton.
Thank you so much, Meb Steiner, once again, President of CSEA Palo Alto Chapter 301. I'd like to start off first by saying thank you for advocating for the concerns expressed by families and staff members around our legitimate fears and anxieties, which I spoke about before. The other two topics that I want to touch upon is the liability issue. I'm deeply concerned, where does that leave our employees? Where does that leave our students and their families? Should, God forbid, worst case happen and someone gets seriously ill or worse than that, lose their life. Many of our employees are part-time employees with low incomes. Their health care comes through their job. And if they're not able to work anymore, where are they? If there's no one who is liable for these long-term effects. So I really applaud any conversations that can be had with the legislature to make that clear and to share in this burden. I also do want to support Ms. Engley's comments about our vulnerable students. I work with these students. I know the challenges. Some of our students are doing much, much better this year than they were in spring. For others, this is not the platform for them. And I think that concern needs to be raised. The last point is the Prop 15. I totally understand the impact on basic aid districts and what that could mean for our district. But I want to point out how blessed we are in Palo Alto. We have an amazing community that supports us. We are financially in really an amazing position compared to the majority of districts in our state. I blame the crazy formula of how we do school funding in our state, bigger problem that won't be addressed tonight. But I urge us to think about equity throughout public education. We are not just an island. Our employees work in different school districts, live in different communities, and their children go to different school districts. So I urge us as we assess this, certainly to balance our fiscal concerns, but also to think from our equity lens that we apply to our students here and think about the equity lens more broadly throughout our state, and urge us to have really constructive conversations to protect both basic aid districts, but also support all of our sister districts throughout the state in ensuring adequate funding for all of the students and public education throughout California. Thank you.
And last is Terry Baldwin. Losing my voice.
Thank you. I also wanted to talk about Prop 15. I think it was said that PAUSD would lose property tax money. In speaking with the Prop 15 creators, basic aid districts will not lose any of their current property taxes. That new corporate property taxes would go to Sacramento and be distributed through the LCFF. But we would keep our current. Actually, basic aid districts will get a minimum of $100 per student. That's not a lot, but that's a minimum, and it's projected to be more for PAUSD. I think it's closer to $1 million. So we won't be losing property taxes. We will only the new property taxes will go into that pool and be given to the districts that need it most. So I think we need to make that clear because that's some of the misinformation that's out there. Also, I would like to say that I do hope that somebody is lobbying for our teachers and our support staff who are concerned about this, disease, this virus, and getting it and being out of work, because it is a scary thing. And talking about nobody wants liability. These are people's lives we're talking about, and we really need to consider that. And that is why you heard from so many teachers and educators tonight about all of this, because again, we need to move at a slower pace, not a faster pace. We need to make sure that we have everything in place before we come back in person. And I just don't think that we do. We have not seen the details of a plan to do that. So I thank you for your time, and I hope that you are lobbying on behalf of everybody here. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. And Kevin, thank you very much for that rundown. I mean, the things that happen in Sacramento seem very far away in Palo Alto. And they're obviously very complicated, and there's now this year more than any. And so it's great to have somebody working with us who can help us understand the machinations and at least give us some insight to what's going to happen. Dr. Austin, do you want to take us out on this?
Yeah, as always, I'd like to thank Kevin and let you know it's not an exaggeration. There are stretches of time when we speak every day, and Kevin is doing work on our behalf routinely. And when there are issues where he is, maybe needing to represent the needs of different groups or schools, we have that conversation. That's part of his job too. But our information is always spot on. And when he calls and gives me a thought about what to look at in the future, to think about, it's very much appreciated, and glad he is part of our team. So thank you, Kevin. Thank you for making the time tonight as well.
Well, it's great to work with all of you, so I appreciate it. And the last three speakers, I've heard what they said, and I think there's legitimate points to everything that they mentioned. And if you need me to do any follow-up with regard to some further answers on, I'm happy to do that as well.
Thank you, much appreciated. Okay, it's 8:15 and we're to our consent calendar. This is a little unusual. We're a little out of order this evening. So the next items, I have to get this out. The next item is our consent calendar, item 4. These items are considered routine and will be approved in one action without discussion. If a member of the public wishes to comment on any consent item, or if a board member would like to pull an item, we'll consider it under action items. And before we begin or take a motion, staff has asked that we pull, it's 4A, right, Dr. Austin?
Yeah, I'd like you to pull the certificated personnel action as we requested earlier in the day.
Okay, so we'll pull 4A and consider it immediately after consent under action. Okay, is there with that proviso, is there a motion on consent?
I move that we approve consent calendar with the exception of item 4A.
I'll second.
Okay, I think Mr. Durop got it in there with the second, so it's Mr. Dauber. And we do have a community comment, so why don't we take that before we discuss and vote?
It's just an order thing. I mean, typically a staff would go first, but it's whatever way you would like to.
No, so this is community comment on the consent calendar.
That's right.
Did you have any comments on the consent calendar?
I will on the one pulled item. So just
no, so this isn't the pulled item. This is the non-pulled items.
Gotcha. Thank you.
I mean, basically, we're asking if any community member wants to pull an item, or ask for an item to be pulled, or comment on a member without pulling item without pulling it. All right. So the one hand up is Kathy.
Mr. Collins, can I comment on 4A now, or?
No, we're going to consider it as a regular item after consent.
Okay.
So that was it? I guess it was. Okay, so we have a motion and a second on approval of the consent calendar. Any discussion? Seeing none, Dr. Austin, could you call the vote?
Yes, provisional vote, Mr. Lee.
Aye.
Ms. Atlas.
Aye.
Ms. DiBrienzo.
Aye.
Ms. Baton Caswell.
Aye.
Mr. Dauber.
Aye.
Mr. Drop.
Aye.
Mr. Collins.
I also vote aye. So the consent calendar is approved unanimously. And now we'll move on immediately to action on item 4A, certificated personnel. And Dr. Austin, you can, Dr. Austin.
All right. Just making sure I was unmuted. I asked this item regarding the recommendation for Director of Student Services, Mr. Jason Krilikowski. And I'd like to just, it's going to take me a couple minutes, but I think it's important that you hear directly from me on this one. Yeah, I think personally, it's unfortunate that some people have the need to look at every person or situation through a deficit lens. And yeah, sometimes the intent is not to learn about others or embrace their strengths, but to dig for any evidence of imperfection or transgressions. And I want to be real honest for just a moment, and I'm going to get into some details in a second. If perfection is the expectation, we'll be disappointed with every candidate that's ever been in a position to lead anything or make decisions. And while diligence is very important, so is understanding situations and looking at the body of work. And regardless, since some things have been said and written, I'd like to share my thoughts and add some context that, in my opinion, has been missing. In the end, people are entitled to any opinions that they want, even after hearing the context. We may see it differently, and that's okay. But our recommendation to the board tonight is unchanged. I'm just going to go through a couple things. It's going to start like, wow, this is not the endorsement we expected, but I just want to call a couple things out. Mr. Krilikowski was suspended for one game as a head varsity football coach. He chose to inappropriately interact with an official after a game. He shared the event from 20 years ago during his interview process, unsolicited, by the way. I expect most people have said something they wish they didn't, and most people have grown up over the last 20 years. The conduct was not repeated, and he took responsibility again for something 20 years ago. The newspaper has now reported twice that Mr. Krilikowski was the principal of San Ramon High School when a student tragically drowned on campus during the school day. It must have been a very sad day and days following and time following. I can only imagine what that's like. Mr. Krilikowski was in his first year as the principal of that high school. He was not accused or found guilty of any wrongdoing or falling short of his job responsibilities. We spoke at length about the situation and how he would support others during tragic events. And I have to tell you, that was one of the more emotional 10-minute spans of my career, thinking back about my time as a high school principal, and I'd had losses on campus as well. But seeing into who he is as a person really helped to go through that conversation and how he's led out of it. Finally, it was reported in the newspaper today that Mr. Krilikowski was named in a lawsuit resulting in a large settlement in his current district. To clarify, the actual events that led to the high-profile claim occurred prior to Mr. Krilikowski's arrival. To restate that, he was not even in the school district when the incident involving a video and ASB eligibility took place at this high school. Now let's fast forward a year after those events occur, those very high profile events. And Mr. Krilikowski is now, at that point, the principal of the high school. The lawsuit was amended, I think more than once, several times, but one such amendment to include a claim of harassment and a lack of investigation. The harassment being student to student and the lack of investigation being district administrators. In fact, Mr. Krilikowski is one of the named complainants, as it would be in any, not complainants, I'm sorry, respondents in the claim, which would be common for anyone in a position leading a high school. There were 12 names in all. But in fact, the incident was investigated. And we know this because Mr. Krilikowski shared it with us. And we reached out to several different people in different levels of positions to ask for their account of the situation. Was there an investigation across the board? Yes. Did he do what would have been expected? Yes. Did he work with other members of the district office administration and attorneys? Yes. Did he work in isolation? No. Did he reach out and try to work with the family? Yes. So again, Mr. Krulikowski's involvement in this case was a tiny sliver of an amended claim. And by all accounts, for everyone that we spoke to in positions to know, acted exactly the way they would have hoped and expected. Also, Mr. Krulikowski was proactively forthcoming and didn't hold back any details. You know, I do know some more of the information, and it would be completely inappropriate for me to talk about the details of a claim from another district. We're not here to discuss the claim or any settlement. This is about the person that we are interviewing, the person that we are recommending, and did he act appropriately? Now, the problem here, and this is part of a culture that we're seeing where things spread into many different areas, but it took the attention off of some things that we think also matter. So while it's fine to report and talk about things and blips and things that we have questions about, I think that there was an omission of other things. Mr. Krulikowski comes to us after serving as high school principal for 8 years. That's something this district it really had a hole in, with high school principals and district office staff with high school backgrounds. He was participated in the Principal's Fellowship at Stanford University. Former athletic director, head coach, made many positive contributions to student athletes. He was a student activities director, or in short, ran ASB. He went through the AXA Personnel Academy, the AXA Aspiring Principals Institute. Known for his warm and inclusive personality, ability to lead teams, and experience working in high demand school districts. I want to just hit on 2 of his references. One of his references said, and this is a quote, "One of his strengths is the way he connects, develops relationships, engages with students, staff, and families. Whether it's in his office, basketball games, picnic tables, or in the classroom, Mr. Krulikowski connects with all stakeholders, listening, motivating, and empowering." And finally, his former superintendent told me that he doesn't typically write letters of recommendation, but he did for Jason. And he did because he's one of the best principals and people he's come across in 40 years. And he added, in quotes, "Jason is a positive role model with readily available integrity." So I think this will probably be my last comments on these things that have come forward. I'll tell you my recommendation stands 100%. And we expect good things from Mr. Krulikowski should he be approved by the Board of Education. I can take any questions that you all may have also. Thank you.
I'm on mute again. Why don't we take community comment, and then we can come back and board members' questions and comments on this item. So we have one hand up, and it is Kathy. Kathy, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. There's an article that was in Palo Alto Online today about Mr. Krulikowski and about the lawsuit that was filed against San Ramon Valley Unified School District and Mr. Krulikowski himself, along with other district defendants. There's a quote from Dr. Austin in that article about an allegation that he did not complete, Mr. Krulikowski did not complete an investigation into a specific claim of harassment. We followed up, and we are confident in the responses we received and are pleased to present him for board consideration this evening. However, I'd like to point you to some public court documents that contradict what Dr. Austin has said, I hope, because Dr. Austin's comments seem to imply that Mr. Krulikowski satisfied him in his responses and others. I don't think that he's probably spoken to the family of Nathaniel Yu or other families necessarily within that district. One of the public documents in that court case is a joint stipulation for case dismissal. A joint stipulation is where all stipulate to the facts. And Mr. Krulikowski is one of the defendants who agreed to this joint stipulation. In that stipulation, the parties stipulated to the following facts: that the school did not prepare an incident report regarding the vandalism that was reported and that a complaint was made about. So the facts that were stipulated to were that Mr. Kolakowski, as the principal of that school, to which the complaint was made, did not prepare an incident report. It doesn't say an investigation wasn't done. The facts that were stipulated to actually said that the school could not determine in its investigation who perpetrated the vandalism. But they stipulated to saying the school did not prepare a report. The family and the student also alleged in the complaint that Mr. Kolakowski enabled and furthered the retaliation that took place to this student who was exercising his constitutional rights. Mr. Kolakowski was the principal. At the time, he came in July of 2017. The incident happened in February, but the vandalism happened on Mr. Kolakowski's watch on the first day of the following school year when he was the principal. The retaliation continued during that school year, and Mr. Kolakowski was the one in charge and the one responsible, which is why he was included as a district defendant. Does Palo Alto Unified want to continue with its past history of squashing students' rights and silencing others?
Thank you. And our last speaker will be Eileen Kim.
Hi, I'm just a little disturbed and perturbed at finding out that PAUSD is on a path to hire someone who does not have a clean past work history and has been involved in a lawsuit where he has been part of and he has agreed to be part of, and the lawsuit has resulted in a settlement. And this lawsuit alleges and has been determined that an Asian student, an Asian American student, had his rights taken away. His rights were not protected. And in fact, he was bullied and the administration staff did not stand up for him. And in fact, was part of this whole process that led to almost a $700,000 payout to an Asian American student for the damages of emotional distress. As an Asian American who grew up not only in Canada, but also in the US, I am a little worried given the past history of what is going on right now and the emotional health and wellness of Asian American students in our community, as well as the political climate of what is known as by our president as the Wuhan virus, that we are even considering to hire someone with even a smidgen remote past history related to treating Asian American students unfairly and not standing up for them, not protecting them, not standing up for their rights, not standing up and protecting their emotional health and wellness. And even if at this point, his past other actions have been appropriate, the fact that he has been involved in this at some level should be a red flag for our board to consider other candidates who have no such history at all, and in fact have a positive history of standing up for all rights of all ethnicities, of all students, including Asian Americans, and especially being kind and inclusive of all colors, of all stripes, of all students. I am very concerned that this is considered a poo-poo, oh, it's not a big deal. Oh, it happened after his watch, or it happened after he just got hired on his first day. It should not be that kind of attitude by this board, given our past culture and history of ethnic discrimination against Asian Americans, as well as African Americans, as well as Latino Americans. PAUSD should be more cognizant of the state that we are in politically and in terms of ethnic bias race. I understand there is no Asian American on the PAUSD board, but please stand up for Asian American community here at the schools. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, board member questions and comments. And looks like Mr. Dauber has his hand up.
Let's see. Thank you, Mr. Collins. Thank you, Dr. Austin, for those comments. I take the obligations of the district and staff to investigate allegations of harassment against students very seriously. I have spent a lot of time on the school board focused on that issue, ran on that issue 6 years ago. One of the reasons we have the superintendent we have, and not a previous superintendent, is because I was concerned to make sure that we had the right leadership in place for that. So I've taken this very seriously, read the article in the Weekly, spent half an hour today talking over the issue with Dr. Austin, making sure that I understood clearly the facts. I'm confident on the basis of that Mr. Kolakowski is a good candidate for this role in our district. And I just want to comment about why that is. The allegation that I was interested in here was the one about whether Mr. Kolakowski had failed to investigate an incident of harassment against a student in his school. The other allegations and incidents didn't seem to me to either involve Mr. Kolakowski at all, or really to call into question his ability to serve as an effective administrator. I think it's perfectly reasonable to look into the past of a candidate to see if there's issues of bad judgment or so forth. But the idea that we're going to find a candidate who's been actively involved in education, particularly as a high school principal and so forth, and find no incidents where someone has taken exception, I don't think that's a very realistic criteria. But this one, did this candidate fail to investigate an allegation of harassment? I think that's a serious issue. In this case, the evidence is that he did investigate and that the staff did investigate this issue and failed to, in fact, I think Ms. Jordan, the member of the public who I think has been concerned on this issue, a member of the public, acknowledged that that an investigation was done and failed to reach a conclusion about who was responsible. The Weekly story contained the allegation in the student's lawsuit that the investigation wasn't done, but that turns out, as far as I can understand, not to be the case. Now, the question about whether there was a report done is a question about whether the other districts' board policies required a report, and whether the person who should have done that report is Mr. Kolakowski, and that seems somewhat murky, but also not to me to raise to the level of, should we consider that this candidate is somehow disqualified? And so on the basis of all of that, I'm confident that these issues are not material and shouldn't concern us about Mr. Kolakowski. Now, the other question is Mr. Kolakowski the right person to lead special services, student services in the district? I will largely leave that to Dr. Austin because, Dr. Austin is the manager in charge of making decisions about suitability. I am encouraged by the reviews that Mr. Kolakowski has received that I've seen and heard about and Dr. Austin has talked about, and by the fact that he has served successfully as a high school principal, because I think to Dr. Austin's point, that's a very important qualification for this role. So I am confident that Mr. Kolakowski is an excellent candidate for this role in the district, that there's nothing of concern in his past record, and I intend to support him.
Thank you. Mr. Darrell.
Thank you. First of all, I echo everything that Mr. Dauber said, and I too looked into it and considered the same issues that Mr. Dauber did. So I won't repeat what he said. I'd like to reassure any folks concerned about the issue of racism, because a commenter did bring that up, racism against Asian Americans. And first I'll say I was surprised actually to hear that there were no Asian Americans on the board. I think perhaps Mr. Lee might have been as well, as would Miss Otla be surprised. But I don't think it matters that three individuals up on the dais are Asian American, because what matters is the board has been very clear in denouncing this type of racism, especially against Asian Americans. We passed a resolution. It's been very clear that the board will not harbor any such racism against people of Asian American descent or any descent. And I wouldn't be comfortable with Mr. Kolakowski if I believed that he would be racist or lead to any racism against Asian Americans. I know that Dr. Austin wouldn't have chosen him, staff wouldn't have chosen him and recommended him for this role. And I think everybody in the community can expect that if there is any individual in this district at all who is contributing to racism against a certain group of people, then that is going to be a place that the board exercises oversight. So I just want to reassure the community that, at least from where I'm sitting, I gladly don't see that as an issue. But of course, as is my responsibility as a board member, something that I will have my eye on with respect to anybody who comes in and has a job in this district that affects our students. Thank you.
Other questions? Oh, Ms. DeBranza has her actual hand up. Sorry, I was looking at the wrong place.
I put it up in the other place too. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a whole lot to add. I have a similar sentiment. We've had a lot of conversations today about this candidate, and as Mr. Durant pointed out, this is, I guess Mr. Dauber did as well. Our job is to let staff do their job, and staff is recommending to us that this is the person, and the explanations that we've been given satisfy me, and I'm ready to see this person come and do a good job in our district. And if anyone in this district illustrates behaviors that are racist in any way against any of our groups that are here in our district or not, that's a problem, and that's something we'll deal with. But this candidate comes recommended to us, and I trust staff to do their job.
Thank you. I'll add just a couple. Oh, go ahead, Ms. Baton-Caswell. I saw your hand late.
Yeah, no, I want to support my colleagues in this. I had a long conversation, as did many of us, with Dr. Austin on the concerns that were brought up. And it's clear to me that there was extensive amount of review done on this candidate. And, anyone who's followed me over my last 12 years here is I have no tolerance for any kind of discrimination. And, I was the one who brought the anti-xenophobia resolution forward. If there's any indication of that, I won't tolerate it. But I'm confident that staff has done their due diligence here and has made the right decision. So I want to just support my colleagues in their feelings on this as well.
Thank you. Let me just add just a couple of points. One is I want to thank the people, and including the Weekly and Ms. Jordan and others who brought this issue to light. I think the only thing that's worse than a worm with an apple with a worm in it is an apple with half a worm. So it is very important to fully vet and sunlight things before decisions are made. And I think the district did a very solid job, and the candidate did a very solid. I'm sorry, I'm laughing at Mr. Brienza's cat, I think there. The candidate was very forthcoming. It's important to make sure that every allegation, every concern gets run down before we make decisions. We don't have pressure on us to make decisions here. We make decisions when we're ready. And it's important to do our work and make sure that we're ready. So I appreciate people bringing it forward. I appreciate the Weekly shining a light on it so that people are aware and where there's transparency to the process. I also appreciate Dr. Austin being so forthcoming in his comments and asking for the item to be pulled so that we could sunlight this in the fashion that it should be sunlighted. I mean, I think the biggest mistake I've seen the district make in the past is that we were defensive. That we made, when we made mistakes or concerned that other people were concerned that we made mistakes, that we circled the wagons and tried to pretend that everything was just okay. And that is, and as I said years ago, you know, I don't think we have that to be defensive because we don't have that much to be defensive about. We run a really good ship here, and I think we need to, and we don't have anything, we're not afraid of the truth. So I think bringing the truth to light is in the best interest of our students, and that's why we're here. And I think, you know, Dr. Austin was very forthcoming in his comments, and I think that's what we want to see. I also will just add, I mean, in addition to talking to Dr. Austin, I reached out directly to people that I know in the district who are in a position to be aware, who knew about the investigation and all its details, and independently was able to verify the facts that the facts that Dr. Austin presented, both privately and in this meeting, that all checked out with my independent sources that have no reason to, and coordinating a fib would be hard to do since they weren't in contact with any of the people that he was talking to. And he didn't know that I was talking to the people I was talking to. So I felt comfortable that, you know, we did on reference reference checks. We did off list reference checks. We also did independent reference checks outside of our normal reference checking process to just double check that this was, you know, that this was what happened. And so I feel good based on this process and, you know, where we've gotten, that this is a recommendations that I'm prepared to support. So are there any other comments? And if not, we can move to a vote on this item. Is there a motion?
I move that we approve the appointment of Mr. Kolakowski as Student Services Director.
Actually, it's you're moving the whole certificated report.
Oh, sorry. I'm moving. Thanks, Mr. Collins. Even though we only talked about Mr. Kolakowski, I'll move the entire certificated report as presented in item in the consent calendar item.
I'll second it.
I'll second.
Okay, I think Mr. Brianza got on first on that one. Dr. Austin, could you take the vote?
Yes, start the preferential vote. Ms. Atlas?
Aye.
Mr. Lee?
Well, I didn't hear. Was that an aye?
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Lee?
Aye.
Ms. DeBrienza?
Aye.
Ms. Peyton Caswell?
Aye.
Mr. Dauber?
Aye.
Mr. Drop?
Aye.
Mr. Collins?
I also vote aye. So item 4A passes unanimously, and that's our only action item for tonight. And so we're on to item 6A, which is the Learning and Continuity Attendance Plan, the formerly known as the LCAP, now known as the LCP. Dr. Austin.
It's still an LCAP. We just took the A out to not confuse me. So I'm going to turn this over to Ms. Ofek, who will frame this up and walk us through.
Great, thank you, everybody. The format of this item is a little bit different from our typical items that we normally hear in that it has two parts. So I will give a brief overview and presentation, and then we'll hold a public hearing. Once I'm done with sharing the overview, Mr. Collins will open the hearing, and then the hearing will happen, and then we will close the hearing and move on. So I just want to share with the community that this is a slightly different process than we normally have on a particular item. So with that, I would like to begin by thanking everyone in educational services, especially Yolanda Conway, Judy Argumetto, and Janine Penny, who have worked tirelessly to juggle along with the rest of us how to understand and bring forward this draft, and also review the revised guidelines for bringing back small cohorts of students so that we could launch PAUSD Plus this week. Countless numbers of webinars have been attended, and reading through documents and holding community input meetings and stakeholder engagement meetings. So I just really want to thank everybody who's participated while also trying to have our district move forward and meet all of the expectations and guidelines for both this plan, but all of the other things we have in motion. So it's definitely a team effort here. So with the passage of SB 98 on June 29th, Education Code 43509 was added, and all schools in the state are required to complete the Learning Continuity and Attendance Plan, which we are referring to as the LCP, so as not to get confused with the Local Control and Accountability Plan for the 2021 school year. The LCP replaces the LCAP. This required plan, which we refer to as the LCP, speaks to how PAUSD will address the continuity of learning in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. The plan is broken into several sections, and I'll just provide a description of what each of the 6 sections is. So there's a general information section, which provides a high-level description of the impact of COVID-19 on PAUSD. It reads much like an annotated timeline, beginning with a summary of actions taking place since March 16th, when PAUSD officially closed. The section on stakeholder engagement outlines efforts made to solicit stakeholder feedback. Because the process to reopen schools was already underway when legislation was passed and the template was released on August 1st, the input solicited in the spring starting in April is permissible in this plan. Regardless of whether or not stakeholder input is incorporated into the plan, this is the section where the feedback on the plans will be placed. With 9 subsections, continuity of learning is the largest section of the plan. This is where in-person instructional offerings are delineated should we be able to return to some form of in-person schooling, a detailed description of distance learning and how PAUSD is providing instruction that ensures access to a full quality curriculum, how the district is supporting students to ensure access to devices and connectivity, the district's actions to assess student participation and progress, resources and professional learning provided to staff to prepare for this year's distance learning and/or hybrid learning programs to come, a description of new roles and responsibilities of affected staff as a result of the pandemic. One such example is we hired an additional ed tech support person for our staff, and we only had one, and in this type of environment, we need more than one person. So those kinds of things are delineated in the new roles and responsibilities section. Plans for supporting students with unique needs, such as special education, English language learners, students with exceptional needs, students experiencing homelessness, and/or students who are in foster care. And finally, in this section, we include how the district plans to assess and address learning loss with particular focus on language arts and mathematics. The next section of the plan is mental health and social emotional well-being, which is where PAUSD's action to monitor and support mental health and social emotional well-being for students is delineated and explained. Another section, pupil and family engagement and outreach, provides a description of how PAUSD is supporting families and removing barriers for students and families. Student engagement, outreach, and re-engagement strategies are all explained. And finally, school nutrition, the final section, explains how PAUSD is providing meals for students who are eligible, whether they are participating in either in-person or distance learning. This template, which again I said was released by the CDE on August 1st, must be completed and approved by September 30th, 2020. So the timeline is quite tight, and it requires this meeting, which is a public hearing, and an approval meeting at a separate meeting. So at our very next board meeting, which is just in time, we will bring this back for final approval. This public hearing portion, though, we will listen to the feedback and take notes. We have one final public community meeting tomorrow, later this week, it's not tomorrow. But we will make revisions based on the input we get, and certainly include and incorporate the feedback or the input from the stakeholder sessions, and in the report that is set aside for that section or that kind of feedback, and then we will bring to you in 2 weeks the final plan. So with that, I will turn things over to Mr. Collins.
Thank you. So to make sure I do this procedurally correctly, we are now going to have a public hearing. Can the board secretary, who is Dr. Austin, help me out here? Make sure we do this right.
Yes. So let me just talk it through again real quick. I know Sharon had already hit it once.
Yeah.
A little bit awkward. So
we're going to open a public hearing, immediately close it, and then move to community comment on the LCP?
No. It'll be easier for this one to open public comment. It's going to open the hearing, which will look very much like public comment. When the last speaker is done, you can close the public hearing, and then the board can have their discussion.
Excellent. Okay, a little different than we've done it in the past, and that sounds like an improvement to me. I always felt awkward about the immediately gavelled open and close public hearings,
Oh, we'll see how it goes.
which was a staple of our past practice.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't have my gavel, so I'll just knock. I hereby open the public hearing on our LCP, and anyone who wishes to address the board on it can raise their hand in Zoom at this time and can speak. And so we'll wait just a beat to make sure we get a good number. It looks like we have 2, now 3. Let's make sure we're not getting close to the limit. Okay, so it looks like it's okay. So the first speaker will be Kathy, just one name, and the second will be Terry Baldwin, and the third speaker is Christina Schmidt. Sorry. Kathy, please go ahead. So why don't we go to Terry Baldwin and we can come back to Kathy? So we'll do Terry Baldwin and then Christina Schmidt, and we can try to come back to Kathy, see if it works.
Thank you. I first want to thank Judy Argumedo for coming to the PAEA Executive Board to present this LCP to us and ask for our feedback and actually create a way to get educator feedback on this. We really appreciate it. We do hope that there's a way for teachers to be involved in the engagement logs because those can be extremely overwhelming. So we're just asking that maybe we can get a group together on that at the different levels. But I really just wanted to thank Judy for all her hard work on this. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, well, Christina Schmidt, and then we'll try Kathy one more time, and then the last speaker will be Meb Steiner. Christina, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
We do.
Okay, hold on. I'm putting my microphone on. I'm so sorry.
First of all, I do want to also thank everyone for bringing this forward. My name is Christina Schmidt. I am the PTA Council President, and I know Ms. Argumedo has worked on the LCAP and now the LCP for many years. So I want to thank the involvement of our community. You know, mental health and wellness is a top priority for the PTA community. Last week at the LCP meeting, we briefly touched on this area, and I'd like to revisit mental health focus of the plan for a moment. Most importantly, how can we support parents to identify the mental health and wellness needs of their children through parent engagement and in education? Also, how do we really scale training for staff and parents beyond counselors and psychologists so that it's a full-on wraparound understanding of how to handle mental health and social emotional well-being? You know, I want to remind everyone that parents are the first responders for our children. And it's our mission, if not our duty, to help everyone understand the mechanism for supporting our children and what that looks like in distance learning and in a pandemic. The LCAP plan incorporates this into Section 4, mental health and social emotional well-being. And I'm really eager to see how we can develop partnerships outside of just the district to really engage as strong interventions for our students, our staff, and our families in Palo Alto. There's a myriad of sustainable actions that we can actually take together, which is public awareness that includes cultural sensitive communication around mental health and wellness, evidence-based practices, well-checked procedures, promoting positive and cohesive school environments across all grades. And of course, in our current pandemic, it's a little harder, but we can do this together. And also to just address the barriers to social emotional wellness that really impact student learning. Finally, I would have to say that part of all of this really incorporates the safety guidelines that everyone has been talking about tonight, and to really look at what that safety checklist really looks like and how we follow the guidelines, but to also engage parents to be part of that reopening and ensure effective implementation of the safety protocols as our campuses reopen. With that, I thank you all, and I look forward to seeing the final plan. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, let's try Kathy again, and then the last speaker will be Meb Steiner.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
We do.
Great. Yes, thank you to Dr. Archimedo and the others for working on this. I wanted to bring up those things that are still missing from the learning continuity plan. The actual language in the law says that the learning continuity plan would be a description of how the LEA will provide continuity of instruction during the school year to ensure pupils have access to a full curriculum of substantially similar quality, regardless of the method of delivery, that will ensure instructional continuity if a transition between in-person instruction and distance learning is necessary. However, Palo Unified did not have information in the learning continuity plan for when and how the transition between distance learning and in-person instruction, whether a hybrid model or full in-person instructional model, would take place, how it would take place. There was also no information, not only in that transition, but on how quarantining would be handled and how instruction would be provided to students forced to quarantine at home without access to that in-person instruction of a hybrid model. Palo Unified suggestion that students have 2 days of independent learning during a hybrid model is really unacceptable for continuity of learning, given that Zoom class lessons, video conferencing, and recording of classroom periods is readily available. Palo Alto Hybrid's plan is to teach the same material twice to Group A students, and then to teach the same material to Group B students without transmitting that in-person classroom instruction to those students mandated to stay home for 3 days a week. We might want to call that the teach it to yourselves model, rather than providing instruction that is happening and can be readily delivered and transmitted to students. There's also nothing that provides information for continuous learning for students of incidents such as what occurred today, when Palo Alto Unified had technical problems preventing student access to classes, or when students have connectivity issues on their end. Of course, recording class periods for later viewing would solve all of these problems. Yet Palo Alto Unified has refused to require that of itself or of its teachers. Similarly, there's nothing in the plan about what Palo Alto Unified will do if there are power outages. All of these things could affect the continuity of learning for our students. And I would ask that Palo Alto Unified include them as part of any learning continuity plan. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last speaker will be Meb Steiner.
Good evening once again, Meb Steiner, President, CSCA Palo Alto Chapter 301. I too want to start by expressing my thanks to Ms. Argumedo and the entire team for reaching out to CSCA and creating opportunities for our, not only our exec board, but for all members to contribute feedback for the LCP. I will say that when one clicked on the plans and also the safety plans, there was not a great deal of detail on the website link that it takes one to. So it would be much appreciated if we could get more details on all of that as we assess our reopening plans and implement them to bring everyone back safely. I also want to emphasize the mental health piece. Absolutely critical for our students. It's something we've focused on for a long time, but equally critical for our staff. And I really urge us to have a very specific plan there as well. My comments earlier addressed that we are really sort of living in a trauma environment, and we should use best practices, trauma-informed practices to support our students, their families, our employees, and perhaps even our community as a whole. I would also like to urge that we have these conversations and include employee feedback at all levels and consistently throughout our school year. The folks who are in the weeds, doing the actual jobs, the multitude of jobs that are required to to run our schools and provide the excellent education that we provide in the many different services, it's really critical to involve their voices. The employees have some terrific creative solutions. They know what's needed. They know what's sort of falling through the gaps, what support they need in order to effectively provide all of the services for our students and their families. So I urge us to not stop after September 22nd when we deliver this report, but actually implement these conversations and have people at the table to provide input and really reach out to our amazing, amazing teachers, admins, leadership, and classified staff to share their knowledge, their expertise, and their passion and commitment to supporting all of our students. And that we just support each other throughout these very, very, very challenging times. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, this item is for discussion only. Is there any, so there's no action to be taken. Are there any board questions or comments on this? Oh, I'm sorry. I have to now close the public hearing, right?
Yes, this would be the time to do that.
Okay, seeing no further public comment, we hereby close the public hearing. And now, are there any additional board member comments or questions? I see Ms. Dubrienza's hand up, and I see Ms. Bacon-Caswell next.
Yeah, I just had a question. It dawned on me that even though over the summer we did some laying out of what the return to campus schedule might look like, I think you noted it briefly earlier tonight, Dr. Austin, but I was wondering if we could just sort of temper expectations for our secondary students, that it is unlikely that even if we stay on red on the list and we keep moving towards a reopening, we're really looking at elementary earlier than secondary, right?
That has been our thought from the beginning, that elementary's return would probably come first for a variety of reasons. And we can definitely jump into that deeper. There's no decision made, but for a lot of reasons, the conditions are so different that we expect elementary to come first.
Great. I just wanted to make sure that we were as clear as we could be on that. Yeah, okay, no, that's it. The other, I can ask later.
Okay, Ms. Bacon-Caswell, and then it looks like Mr. Drop has his hand up.
Yeah, Dr. Austin, I'm not sure I'm clear on what happens in the case of a live teacher being quarantined or somebody in a class that's live. So if we have the opportunity to go back, what happens then? How is that handled? I don't see that in this report.
So just to clarify, is your question specifically about how do we handle substitute situations?
No, because if we had somebody who was exposed, who was teaching a live class, then everybody that was in that class is exposed too.
I understand. So you're talking about what would happen if we come back, there's live instruction and there's a case. Is that your question?
Yes.
Okay. That is, it's clearly outlined in the state guidance. And what I don't know, and I may ask Sharon to jump in here real quickly, is there an appropriate space in this report, or is that a side issue? So Ms. Ofek, are you available to interject? Thanks.
Yeah, we can certainly add it in, but we have places where we're saying we're going to abide by the county guidelines and the Department of Public Health, which is where that is all delineated. And given the constant changes that we keep experiencing, we decided to go with that language instead of being super specific, just saying that we'll abide by whatever the county public health department guidelines are.
So the county public health guidelines will be about public health. And I'm just wondering about continuity of the educational program, because that group will fall behind the other groups. Or not, maybe there's some way to keep them going. But I think we need to talk about that.
Ms. Baton Caswell, I think your last sentence just helped me really clarify what you're asking. So I can work with Ms. Ofek on that. I think I got it now. So you're live. The public health will say, well, you're going to be quarantined. They will always dictate the number of days and who's quarantined. But your question is more at the heart of, and how do we keep education going if that's the case? Got it. We can absolutely get that in there for you.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Drop.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, staff, for this this document. It's very thorough. I said to somebody else that all your questions about reopening can probably be answered in some fashion by referencing this document. And it's, I think it provides a really nice high level, but sufficiently detailed look at what we're doing and what our sort of scenario is right now. The one area that I think would benefit from a little more detail, and I understand this document isn't the everything document, but on every level of detail, but I do think the mental health and social emotional well-being could use a little more sort of TLC, because I think this is an area that we focus a lot on the logistics, because this is a time when the logistics are so important and the ball keeps moving. And we talk a lot about how we're going to support our various cohorts of students in different ways, physically and nutrition and intangible ways. And we always talk about mental health and social emotional well-being. It would be really helpful for me, and I know members of the community have reached out to me as well, to see in this document a little more about specifically how we're going to monitor and support mental health and emotional well-being. In addition to the ways that are listed here, what are the tracking mechanisms? How often are we going to be looking at those metrics? What are we going to do with them? I think it would give us, at least give me, a better idea of what it exactly means to be supporting mental health and social emotional well-being at a time when it's very different than the measures we would have used in the past. That's all for me.
Got some notes. Thank you.
Okay, any other comments or questions on the LCP? It looks like Mr. Lee is going to weigh in. Go ahead, Mr. Lee.
Yeah, I just want to echo everyone else's just gratitude towards all the work the staff has put in to create this plan. I think that we've heard over these past few board meetings that a lot of students also have input with regards to how distance learning and return to learn is going to occur. So I just wanted to ask if there have been any opportunities for students to provide direct input on the LCP.
I'm going to ask Ms. Ofek to pop back in.
Hi, so we use the data that the students took, the survey data from the student survey from last week will be the input that we use for the next draft, the final draft. That's what our plan was. That gets a large amount of voices without requiring a Zoom call. And also, just to add in, it's an expansion of what ASB, it's a more expanded group of students than just ASB.
Thank you for that.
And now Miss Atla. Please correct me. Please teach me how to pronounce your name real quick. Atla?
My first name or my
No,
last?
last name. Atla?
Oh, Atla, yeah.
Atla. Okay, thank you.
I have a quick question. I know that the document that was linked to the agenda online included the schedule, the bell schedule, and I was wondering if we vote on this at the next board meeting, is this set in stone? Can we not go back and make edits depending upon student opinion? Because I know there were several people who weren't in favor of the 7-day schedule.
You want me to take that, Dr. Austin? Okay.
Sure
So we're taking all of the input, and I want to just point out to everybody that this is a really compressed timeline. This has to be turned in, and everybody knows that things will continue to change as we continue to live through this pandemic. So even whatever we submit that gets approved, can be changed afterwards because the conditions in our community will change. So whether or not we get to a point by the time this plan gets submitted by the deadline, whether or not we get to a plan that includes a change or not on that schedule, we can always make a change. I don't want everyone to think that because we wrote it into this plan and we submitted it by this deadline and followed all the timeline that we can't do anything different. That's not the case. We can make changes past this because everybody knows that this is a moving and changing situation, very dynamic.
Thank you. So it sounds like we're not a prisoner of our plan.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Mr. Brianza, is that your hand up now? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, there's just one more thing. I maybe should have asked it when the superintendent was doing his report, but I know that you mentioned the survey and now Ms. Affected as well. And I'm wondering if there's a chance that we'll see those results. And I know initially you said we do a survey every other week, and I'm wondering if we're planning to do another one soon.
We are going to do another one soon, soon meaning either this week or next week. So I'd call that soon. And yes, we're trying to put the results into a format that makes sense to look at. And Derek is working on that now, and we'll summarize and get that out in some update material.
Great. And one side comment, it's not really a question, but I'm just remembering a few years ago, students weren't really excited about a block schedule because the periods were too long. And we had some of our schools still had every period every day. And I kind of love that now, like, I guess block schedules aren't, the blocks aren't too long, which is great. And they're so used to a block schedule that back to that 7 periods a day sounds unreasonable. And I'm actually really grateful for that. So.
Back in our day, we did 7 periods a day, 7 days a week. Great. If there are no other comments, then this can come back when you're ready for either more discussion or for action. Okay, moving on to item 6B, and this is again for discussion, authorization to bid maintenance projects. Dr. Austin.
This one is Ms. Chow, and I'll ask her to go ahead and join us now.
Good evening. This next item is a discussion item, but it is a request from the board to solicit some bids for a couple of roofing projects, specifically 2 roofing projects. One is at Juana Briones. It's the occupational health building, and the second is at JLS over the girls and boys locker room. Repairs are quite extensive, and they need to be go out to work for this. For both of these projects, and so we're asking the board's permission to go out to bid.
Any questions and comments for Ms. Chow? Okay, so perhaps next time we'll bring this back on consent. Okay, so no further discussion on that. We can move to item 7A, which I think will also involve Ms. Chow, the 2019-20 unaudited financials and budget update for 2020-21. Dr. Austin.
Yes, we have, first of all, I want to thank Ms. Chow and her entire team for really top quality background and report on this very important item, but we've asked Ms. Chow today to hit a couple of the key takeaways and not necessarily walk through every aspect of the report. So Ms. Chow, you have it.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen here. And Mr. Collins, can you give me a thumbs up if you're able to see the PowerPoint? Great. Okay, so this next item, this next budget agenda item is the unaudited financial report for 1920. So it's the year we just wrapped up. It represents the closing of the books for 1920. And similar to the challenges that were prevalent throughout K-12 education in the spring and in the summer, this year's closing of the books is reflective of an unprecedented fiscal year. The COVID-19 pandemic, the shelter-in-place order, school closures, all had a notable impact on the district's budget as it relates to both the revenue and the expenditure side of the budget. When the budget for the 2021 fiscal year was developed in the spring, we had projected that we would see some reductions in our local revenue for the remainder of the 1920 year. And these were primarily due to anticipated areas where we expected reduced facility rental income, as well as a reduction to some parent donations resulting from our school sites being closed. We also projected adjustments to the expenditure side of the budget. Specifically on the expenditure side, we anticipated savings to utilities and to other services that were planned but not likely to be accessed during the school closure. At this time in the spring, we were uncertain how long we would be closed and if the closure would last through the end of the school year. We did know that we had new and unbudgeted expenditures in response to the pandemic. We were closely tracking these. Examples of these increased expenditures were in the areas of purchasing safety supplies and equipment, PPE for staff and students, meals for students, and instructional materials that were sent home to families. As we now know, schools were closed well beyond the initial timeline and remain closed through the end of the school year. The impact to the budget was that many of the planned expenditures did not materialize because while the district was closed and operating differently, so too were our vendors and consultants who would normally provide these services. Many of these expenditures, such as outside services for field trips, conferences, and district-wide professional development, could not happen during the shelter in place, or in some cases, they have been postponed to this current budget year when those services could be delivered more proficiently and safely. In either case, these expenditures represent one-time savings from the 1920 budget year. So as we look at the summary of revenue and expenditures for 1920, revenues were down 3.5 million and expenditures were down by 14.2 million. This is from the estimated actuals. The net change to the ending fund balance, which is the bolded figure in the chart, is that there was an increase to the ending fund balance of 10.7 million in one-time savings. Now, this represents both good news and perhaps some not so good news. I'm going to choose to start with the good news. And the good news is that we underestimated our expenditures. Specifically, we underspent in our budget. And the not so good news is that these are not ongoing savings because we'll be seeing them coming back in our budget for the 2021 fiscal year. So this slide gives us a more detailed understanding of the changes to revenue. While we had areas of both increases and decreases to revenue, the primary decreases on the revenue side were the reduction to the STRS and PERS on behalf contribution. That's the $2.6 million savings that you see nearly in the middle of the chart, which again, as a reminder, is a paper only entry because there is an equal and offsetting expenditure in the same amount on the expenditure side of the budget. And the general fund contribution for COVID related expenses, these are for funds that were allocated in the 1920 fiscal year, but were not received. So here we see the changes to expenditures. This would be representing the expenditure side of the budget. Quickly glancing at the chart, we can see that we had savings in nearly every expenditure category, with the most notable decline was in the area of other services. These were services with our outside vendors and consultants that were not able to be delivered during the shelter in place. It's important to reiterate once again that these are one-time savings and not ongoing savings. They will be recognized as savings in this current budget, the unaudited actuals. And in cases where expenditures were postponed and occurred after July 1st, they will be shown as expenditure increases in the 2021 budget. So what that means is if there was conferences or professional development that was planned for May and was postponed by only 2 months and it happened in July, that now moves from one fiscal year to the next. The distinction between the one-time and ongoing expenditures is critical to the understanding of our budget, because in our budgeting process, it is the ongoing expenditures which represent the things that we value, such as our staffing and our regular student programming. Okay, looking to the ending fund balance in the general fund, we see the usual categories with the exception of 2 new additions to our assigned ending fund balance. The change to an ending fund balance provided an
Carolyn,
opportunity. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. I
Sure.
think the bottom of your slide is slightly cut off on our view. Maybe you could
Okay.
just scroll down a couple of lines. There you go. Okay,
Is
perfect.
that helpful?
Yes, perfect. Thank
Okay,
you.
great. So this change in our ending fund balance provided a unique opportunity for us to set aside some funds for a parcel tax reserve. As you're aware, the parcel tax revenue provides approximately $16 million in revenue to the general fund. Without this revenue, reductions of that same amount would need to be made. This reserve would reduce that amount by half for the first year only. There is also a small set aside for COVID expenditures should there be a need. Okay, so that's a brief summary of our unaudited actuals for the 1920 budget. Looking ahead to the adopted budget, there are a couple of changes that I wanted to bring forward for the board's attention. And namely, there are 2 notable items that we know at this point in time. One is the change to the property taxes, and the other is the allocation of the learning loss mitigation funds. We met with the county assessor and controller teams at the end of August, actually August 28th. And in that meeting, there was some strong caution around the property tax numbers, the preliminary numbers that we're seeing here. I think Mr. Gordon also referenced this in some of his comments earlier this evening, but in a nutshell, what we see is, at this point anyways, the secured taxes have been relatively stable at this point. The increase at the end of August was 6.77% over the prior year. However, quite a bit of instability around the unsecured property taxes. And this is largely represented by the commercial buildings that Mr. Gordon was speaking of earlier. The decrease on the unsecured side is nearly 20%. And there's also a decrease on our homeowners exemption in the amount of $6,000. So when we look at our property taxes, we look at them in total. So the total property taxes as of the end of August show a preliminary growth of 5.17% or approximately 2.8 million. The other area on the upcoming budget changes for our 2021 budget is the state allocation of the learning loss mitigation funds. This is to address specific areas related to learning loss mitigation. So as a preview of coming attractions, if these property tax and learning loss mitigation funds hold constant, we will be adding those to the budget at first interim in December. Okay, does this slide show up completely?
Yes.
Or do I need
Maybe
to
if you scroll it up just a little bit, it'll be a little easier, but definitely
Okay.
can see it all. Yeah, perfect.
Great.
Perfect.
Okay, wonderful. So, so by now you probably all know my thoughts on the multi-year projection. I consider the multi-year projection to be the most valuable tool for assessing the district's financial well-being because the multi-year provides more than a single year snapshot of the budget. It provides a look at the financial trend as well as the direction of the district. So for this reason, I always like to share this resource with the board, even at this late hour. Taking a look at our 5-year multi-year projection, beginning with the budget year, which is our 2020-21 year, and each of the 4 out years, you'll notice that our district is projecting to be in a deficit spending mode. Now, these are what I'm referring to are the numbers that are in the middle of the chart in red parentheses. The reason that I'm calling your attention to this is that we're deficit spending with the assumption that we are having continued parcel tax revenue. The situation takes a very different and dramatic turn when we look at the numbers at the bottom of the chart in red, because these are the numbers with the parcel tax revenue removed. So clearly a very different situation. With the parcel tax, we have starting out with a somewhat sustainable deficit spending pattern that increases to 8.4 million in our final year. And this pattern is accelerated rapidly without the parcel tax. In fact, what it represents, in all honesty, is a district in financial distress. And under this situation, staffing and program contingencies would need to be put in place. Okay, so what's coming up next? Well, the very first thing is at our next board meeting, the unaudited actuals will come to the board for approval. And then we have on the November ballot, the parcel tax measure is up for renewal, and that will be determined by our local voters. In December, we then move to focus more on our 2021 budget as the first interim is presented to the board in December. Then in January, we have one last look at the 1920 financial statements. This is after our auditor with E. Bailey has done their audit, and they'll be presenting the financial statements to the board, most likely at the January meeting. So with that, that concludes my report on the unaudited actuals, and I'm happy to take any questions at this time.
Thank you. So if there are any community comments or questions on this, now's the time to raise your hand. Oh, and there's one. Let's see if I can get it. Okay, so it looks like we have a small number. So Meb Steiner. Give me, there we go. There's our timer.
Thank you. Once again, Meb Steiner, President of CSEA Palo Alto Chapter 301. First, I'd like to thank Ms. Chow and her entire team for getting this presentation together. I know how much work that is for our folks in the business office and presenting the numbers. I had a couple quick points. One is really that we review some of these vendor and contractor services. It looks like there was some fairly substantial savings there. I know in the past board members have spoken about taking a look at that to try and see what we could provide in-house rather than using outside contractors or vendors. So I urge us to take a look at that as as we move forward. I think there could be some substantial savings and creative solutions that we could find there. The other piece that I want to emphasize, and I think Ms. Chow did a lovely job of sort of showing what the parcel tax means for our district. And I, have shared before, I have been a part of PAUSD for 53 years. Starting when I was 7 years old and moved to this country with my family. So I've been a student, a parent, and an employee. And I have always been amazed and value the incredible support of our community for public education and for our schools. And I once again want to emphasize how important it is that we rely once again on our community to stand with us and support us and extend their generosity that they have so often done. CSEA has endorsed the parcel tax. Our members support it. We are asking for funds to support helping pass the measure and provide volunteers. And I really urge all of us to give that support, because it is so critical for our school district and our students, and all the amazing programs and supports and excellence in education that we provide. So I express my hope and optimism and believe that our community will step up. And I just want to thank our community in advance for always being there for us. And I hope that they will be once again. Thank you.
Thank you. That's the only community comment. So we can move now to board members' questions and comments. Why don't we just raise hands if there are any? I do have a comment. First, thank you for that presentation. It was very clear, as all your presentations are, and I really appreciate that. I know this is incredibly detailed and complicated stuff, so I'm very appreciative of that. The one comment, and maybe you can share your screen again and show the 5-year projection, because that's, because part of what I heard is, wow, we've got this windfall savings that we experienced at the end of last year because we weren't able to spend money because the schools were closed. But a lot of that is going to come back and have to be expended this year, because a lot of it was just things that were delayed because we couldn't do it. And then the other point was, well, that's really just one-time money. And I think the saying I've heard in school finance is, you can't fund with one-time money anything that eats, which is to say any of our wonderful employees who do all the work that supports our students. So we can't really count on one-time savings for more than kind of one-time cushions or one-time expenditures. And when I look at the 5-year projection, I find it very sobering. Because even if we do renew the parcel tax, and I agree with Meb Steiner, I really hope and expect that the community will step up and do it. So valuable to our, so central to our financial picture and the kind of offering we have for students. But looking at if the parcel tax is renewed, we're basically in the red. It's the excess of revenue or over expenses line, kind of in the lower middle there. We are in the red every year for the foreseeable future. And there are a bunch of assumptions in there about property tax revenue, but there's also an enormous headwind. I would argue a headwind as enormous as any we've faced as a country and as a district in terms of financial and economic pressure. So, I think this is a very sobering picture, and I think we need to be very mindful of this. We're heading into very, very choppy and uncertain waters. And the only way I know to protect against that is to maintain reserves, because reserves equal future options. You run out of reserves, you're out of options. So if we think we're going to have potential deficits, the only way to keep from having draconian cuts in future years is to conservatively manage now, so we can keep our expenses in check and have reserves to deal with things as they come to us. So I really appreciate this perspective, because we're very focused on the year to year, and this helps us pull out and really see the big picture, which I think is so important to kind of frame all of our thinking. So thank you. I didn't really have a question, but thank you for presenting this. All right, Mr. Brianza, did you have your hand up? I'm sorry. So Mr. Dauber, he has his hand up.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you, Mr. Collins, for sort of pointing to the long term here. So, Ms. Chow, there are two sort of factors going on in this chart that I wanted to call out and maybe ask you about. The first is the parcel tax, where obviously we can't run the kinds of deficits that are implied by a failure of the parcel tax to pass and still maintain our expenditures. This is assuming that we would maintain our something like our current expenditure structure, but really these deficits are of a size that we would have to make huge cuts because we could not sustain a budget that showed these actual deficits. Is that a right way to read this?
That is absolutely correct. So as we get closer in first interim, we will likely need to present to the county when we submit first interim, both a scenario that is with and without the parcel tax. And most likely we'll need to have a statement from the board that there will be action taken to address the budget shortfall should we not be successful with that ballot measure in November. So that's yeah.
So we wouldn't actually be able to spend, in 2022, 23, $287 million in the absence of a parcel tax. We'd have to cut that in order to reflect the lack of revenues, right?
That is correct. Yeah. That is correct. The other thing I guess I wanted to ask you about is that these property, a lot of our revenues, obviously projection is driven by the assumptions that we make about property tax increases. And one of the, one way to think about this is that COVID has delivered us a very short term as a sort of windfall in terms of a shortfall in expenditures, but it's also probably delivering us an economy that's going to give us lower property taxes in the longer term, in the medium and longer term. Is that right? And that effect is really going to overwhelm this short-term expenditure savings. Is that a reasonable way to think about this? That is more than reasonable. There's another factor that plays into the property taxes, and that is that the governor gave a waiver on the penalties for late payment on property taxes until May of 2021. So while those property taxes are due in December and April, they waived the late penalties all the way through May. So there are folks and businesses who are taking advantage of that waiver. And for that reason, the county has had difficulty giving us accurate numbers on what those property tax receipts are, because there are people that are taking advantage of that waiver of the penalties through next May.
Oh, okay, I understand what you're saying. So we don't really have a good fix on what our revenues are, even for revenues that we're expecting, because they haven't shown up yet. Some subset of them haven't shown up yet.
Correct.
Is that right?
That is correct. And depending on what that looks like as we work our way through these out years and through this recession, the county is a teeter county, meaning that they distribute the property taxes to the district based on what has been billed, not necessarily what is collected. So if people are late in paying taxes, or if they are defaulting on their taxes and the county doesn't collect enough, they have talked about, Larry Stone has talked about, if collections are down significantly, they may need to look at coming out of the teeter system. Fortunately, we have a trans in place this year. The board was very supportive of doing that. That put us in a very good position for our cash flow. I think that's likely to be something we're going to see in our future going forward with this instability around our property taxes.
Yeah, I think that really does underline, as others have said, the importance of the parcel tax. And even with the parcel tax, it's a pretty sobering picture. Thank you.
Mr. Branda, just before you go, I just wanted to add one quick point to what the point that just raised about the headwind on the property tax. I think I read in your report, Ms. Chow, that the number of contested assessments is up, what, 9-fold?
Ninefold. Mhm.
So, you know, if ever was a forward indicator of downward pressure on property taxes, that's the one. So yeah, I just wanted to call that out because it was so striking when I read it. Sorry, Mr.
And,
Please go ahead.
and not to be, I don't know, Debbie Downer on that, but there's also, those are the ones that they've received. There's also a backlog of decline in value assessments because the, you know, the county office was closed for a while there during the shelter in place. And so they are working on that backlog in addition to the ones that they're receiving for the current year.
Good. All right. Sorry, Mr. Brienza.
Oh, no worries. I just wanted to confirm, I mean, I think this is true, but I just want to confirm that all the projections that you're making here assume maintaining the same staffing levels, right?
Slightly, there's a slight twist on that. It's assuming a decline of about 200 students per year. So,
but staffing ratios.
Right.
Staffing
ratio is the same, yes, but a slight decline each year in student enrollment.
So you are assuming a decline in enrollment, which we have seen a trend of, but keeping the ratios what we've had them.
That is correct.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments for Ms. Chow? Okay, that looks like, thank you. I think that was really informative, super informative and somewhat sobering. So appreciate it on both counts. Dr. Austin, any final words on this?
No, I think the same thing. I think we will benefit from being cautious and listening, really taking actions around some of the things you guys have all mentioned, including the importance of reserves and the understanding that we're in uncertain times with some pretty obvious rocks in the water for us to avoid. So I thank Ms. Chow and the team again.
Yeah, great job. Thank you. And thank you to your whole team. The last item on our agenda before board operations is an information item on the board calendar. And I did want to just make a comment on this. This is the first, I guess, sunshining of the proposed board calendar. It goes into the kind of detail that we went into last year, where it lays out over the course of the year, things that we expect and want to deal with. So I don't know if people have had a chance to look at it, but I think over the next couple of weeks, it would be useful if people look at it and say, hey, is there anything that I think is important that isn't represented here, or we only talk about it once, maybe we should talk about it twice. But I just think it's a useful discipline to kind of lay these things out in advance. So instead of being reactive, where we've set a course for ourselves for the year. Oh, go ahead, Mr. Brienza.
Well, I was going to do it during board operations, but it kind of relates to calendar items and when we see stuff. So I guess I'll do it now. Back in June, I think it was in June, we passed a resolution supporting our Black families. And at the time we noted that it wasn't a plan and it wasn't asking for a plan. Well, we didn't say it wasn't asking for a plan. We just noted that it wasn't a plan, and we knew that we had all this COVID planning in front of us. But now that we are back here as we are, and we're having regular meetings, and we've got a calendar here, the very last commitment in our resolution is that we will confront the biases in our own district and actively engage in the challenging work of dismantling our problematic practices. And I would like to know what staff's plans are for doing that. I don't know if that means a big update in a couple months. I don't know if it means a regular update. I know that I'm not seeing the equity snapshot on here, and I don't know if that's because it's embedded or because we've been busy with other things, but I want to make sure that we're not only talking about the supports we're giving to students, but the work that we are doing stated out in that statement about actively engaging in the challenging work of dismantling the problematic practices. So I'd really like to see the plans for that come back at all levels of staff, from board to our executive cabinet to all principals and teachers and staff. I don't know if anyone else has anything to say about that on our board.
Yeah, Dr. Austin, any comment on that?
Yeah, I think in general, what we're looking for are the avoidance of the high stake one meeting shot. So a couple things, just as a reminder, to build this first shot at the calendar, we pulled last year's calendar. It is actually a fantastic exercise in looking at the breadth of items that we touched last year, but also a reminder that items are added about a month out. And in that even last year's calendar evolved as we went. So I think we're at a more robust starting point with plenty of room to grow. So I would expect to see more routine updates versus the one behemoth.
So
I would love to see routine updates.
let's figure out how.
Routine updates on structural racism sound wonderful to me. I'd love routine updates
figure
on
out
that.
the right timing and framing of that.
Yeah.
All right.
for
I
sure.
think Mr. Darup, did you have your hand up?
I just wanted to echo Misty Brianza. I think it's when we pass resolutions, just a different point. When we pass resolutions and we're speaking as a board, it's incumbent on us to make sure that there's follow-up as a board as well. So I agree with Misty Brianza, and I think it's appropriate to consider in building out the calendar.
Go ahead, Ms. Bing as well.
Well, I also would like to support that, and particularly rather than high stakes reports, to have some roll out about what we're doing. I also would like to see something around dyslexia and reading. We spent a lot of time talking about that over the last 2 years. So I'd like to see that in the calendar, and I'd rather that not be high stakes either.
Yeah, good point. Mr. Dauber, is your hand up from before, or is that a new? Okay.
No, it's not still up, sir. Collins.
No problem. Any other comments on the calendar? And this is a living document, as they say. So I'm sure we'll see revisions in it next time and probably every time after that. So if you have other comments if you look at it more and reflect on it, you can send them to me. You can send them to Dr. Austin. This is our agenda, so we should, get one that we like. Okay, and nothing else on information items. We're on to item 9, board operations. It's funny because this used to be filled with, I went to this meeting, I went to that meeting, I went to the Harvest Festival, I went to and now it's like, I was on this Zoom call, I'm on that Zoom call. Mr. Drop, go ahead.
So Misty Brianza and I had an opportunity to speak with a number of parents at Hoover following the board's decision to reject bids last meeting, to clarify some misunderstandings, to address some concerns, and generally to listen to concerns that parents had about construction at Hoover and what the board's decision actually meant. I have found it to be a very useful and helpful engagement with the community, and it was overall very, very positive. I invited many of those parents to come by our next property committee meeting, and I expect they will, and it will be a lively committee meeting. Earlier, Mr. Dauber, you talked about how much you love committees. I invite you to come to the next property committee meeting as well and witness. But that's my update. Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay. Seeing no further comments, and that being the last item on the agenda, it's 9:50 p.m. and we are adjourned. Have a nice evening, everybody.